Hey everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know a lot of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and just relax.
The disappearance of the Sodder children. The snow fell thick and heavy on Christmas Eve, 1945, blanketing the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia in a deceptive peace. Inside the Sodder family home, 10 children helped their mother Jenny prepare for Christmas morning while their father George finished his last-minute deliveries for his trucking company. None of them could have imagined that by dawn, 5 of the children would vanish without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt the family for generations. George Sodder was a man who spoke his mind, perhaps too freely for his own good. An Italian immigrant who'd built a successful business from nothing, he had strong opinions about Mussolini and wasn't shy about sharing them at his local Italian community gatherings. In a town where many Italian immigrants still harbored sympathies for their former homeland's fallen dictator, George's vocal criticism had earned him enemies. Just months before that fateful Christmas Eve, a stranger selling life insurance had visited the house. When George declined to purchase a policy, the man's demeanor turned threatening. "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke," he'd snarled, "and your children are going to be destroyed. You'll pay for the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini." George had dismissed it as the ravings of a disgruntled salesman. He would later wish he'd taken it more seriously. That Christmas Eve started like any other. The older children, Marion, 23, had already left to start her own family, but John, 22, was home from the army. Then came the younger set: George Jr., 16, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, Betty, 5, and the baby Sylvia, just 2 years old. The house bustled with excitement as the children begged to stay up late playing with their new toys. Jenny finally relented, allowing them to stay up while she retired to bed with George and Sylvia around 10 p.m. At 12:30 a.m. the phone rang. Jenny stumbled from bed to answer it, hearing an unfamiliar woman's voice asking for someone she didn't know. She could hear glasses clinking and laughter in the background, sounds of a party or a bar. The woman laughed strangely when Jenny said she had the wrong number, then hung up. Jenny noticed that the downstairs lights were still on and the curtains open. Assuming the children had forgotten to close up before going to bed, she went downstairs, turned off the lights, locked the door, and returned to bed. 30 minutes later, a sharp noise on the roof jolted her awake, a rolling sound like a heavy ball tumbling down toward the gutter. Then came the smell of smoke. George woke to Jenny's screams of "fire." The bedroom was already filling with smoke. He could hear the crackling of flames consuming the wooden frame of their 2-story home. In the chaos that followed, George and Jenny managed to escape with Sylvia and John, who'd been sleeping downstairs. Marion's room was near her parents' and she made it out. But the stairway to the attic where the other 5 children slept, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, was already engulfed in flames. George ran to the side of the house where he kept a ladder, but it was gone, mysteriously vanished from its usual spot. His coal trucks, which he could have driven next to the house to climb onto the roof, wouldn't start. Both vehicles had been running perfectly the day before. In desperation, he tried to haul water from the rain barrel, but it was frozen solid in the winter cold. The phone line had been cut, discovered later to have been sliced clean through, not burned. Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. Due to the holiday and what the fire chief would later call communication problems, the Fayetteville Fire Department, located just 2.5 miles away, didn't arrive until 8 a.m., 7 hours after the fire started. By then, the Sodder home had been reduced to a smoking basement of ashes. The fire chief delivered the news the family dreaded but expected. The 5 children who'd been trapped upstairs had perished in the fire. But then came something strange. No bones were found. no remains at all. The fire chief suggested the fire had been hot enough to completely cremate the bodies. George, who knew something about fire from his work, found this explanation impossible to believe. The fire had burned for only 45 minutes before the roof collapsed. Household fires, even at their hottest, rarely exceed 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Complete cremation requires temperatures of at least 1,400 degrees, sustained for 2 hours or more. Even then, bone fragments and teeth typically survive. A brief, perfunctory investigation followed. The coroner's inquest, held the very next day, declared the fire accidental, caused by faulty wiring. Death certificates were issued for the 5 missing children. The family was advised to accept their loss and move on. But George Sauter couldn't let it go. Too many things didn't add up. First, there was the ladder, found days later thrown in an embankment 75 feet away from the house. Someone had deliberately moved it. Then there were the trucks. Examination showed their engines had been tampered with. The phone line hadn't burned. It had been cut, sliced clean at a point 14 feet above ground and 2 feet away from the house. An electrician had recently inspected the house's wiring and declared it safe. The power company confirmed that the electrical service to the house had been turned off before the fire started, making an electrical fire impossible. George hired a private investigator. What they uncovered sent chills down the family's spine. A bus driver reported seeing balls of fire being thrown onto the Sauter roof moments before the fire started. A woman at a Charleston hotel claimed she'd seen the 5 children with 4 adults of Italian extraction a week after the fire. The adults had prevented the children from speaking to her. Another woman, a waitress at a diner 50 miles away, served breakfast to 5 children matching their descriptions on Christmas morning. "I served them breakfast," she insisted. The children were too young to be traveling without parents. They kept asking about their parents, but the men with them wouldn't let them talk. The most disturbing discovery came when George decided to bulldoze the site to create a memorial garden. While sifting through the ashes, they found several small bones and what appeared to be human vertebrae. Rather than supporting the cremation theory, a pathologist determined the bones showed no signs of fire damage. They appeared to have been placed there after the fire. More mysteriously, the pathologist identified them as coming from someone much older than any of the missing children. Then came the supposed sightings and the photographs. In 1967, 22 years after the fire, Jenny received an envelope addressed only to her. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his 30s. On the back, someone had written, "Louis Sauter. I love brother Frankie. Illo boys." A 90132 or 35. The family was convinced the man in the photo was their Louis, aged appropriately. They hired another private detective to track down the photo's origin, paying him a substantial retainer. He vanished with their money and was never heard from again. George and Jenny erected a billboard along Route 16, featuring pictures of their 5 missing children and offering a reward for information. The reward grew from $5,000 to $10,000, a fortune in those days. Tips poured in from across the country. Someone claimed to have seen the children in Florida. Another spotted them in Texas. A woman in New York was certain Martha had been her neighbor for years. Each lead was investigated. Each led nowhere. The family learned of similar cases, children who disappeared in fires where no remains were found. They discovered what seemed to be a pattern of Italian-American families being targeted. George remembered more threats he'd received, not just from the insurance salesman but from other members of the Italian community who'd objected to his anti-Mussolini stance. One man had told him, "One day your children will pay for your tongue." A new theory emerged. The children had been kidnapped as part of an extortion plot or vendetta connected to George's Italian background and his criticism of those who still supported Mussolini. The fire had been set as a cover. The children had been taken either to be sold into adoption or to be raised by other Italian families as revenge for George's betrayal of his heritage. In 1949, George traveled to New York City after receiving a tip that Maurice was attending a local school under an assumed name. He found a boy who looked remarkably like his son, but authorities refused to investigate without more evidence. The boy disappeared from the school the next week. The investigation revealed more suspicious characters. One was a man named C.C. Tinsley, who'd been among the jury members who declared the fire accidental. Tinsley later admitted he'd found a rubber gasoline container in the basement of the Sauter home but hadn't mentioned it during the inquest. When pressed, he claimed a police officer had told him to keep quiet about it. Years passed. George aged rapidly, consumed by the search for his children. He received ransom notes demanding money for the children's return, but they always turned out to be cruel hoaxes. One particularly vicious prankster sent detailed letters for months, describing where the children were being held, only to eventually admit he'd made it all up for fun. The FBI was asked to investigate multiple times but declined, saying there was no evidence of a federal crime. Local law enforcement seemed eager to let the case die. When the family pushed for the fire site to be excavated more thoroughly, they were told it would be too expensive and pointless. When they offered to pay for it themselves, they were denied permission. More witnesses came forward over the years. A minister claimed he'd seen the children in a car with Florida license plates. A chambermaid at a motor lodge swore Martha had stayed there but had been kept under close watch by a woman claiming to be her mother. Each witness was credible, their stories detailed and consistent. Yet nothing ever came of any of it. The most haunting testimony came from a woman named Ida Crutchfield, who claimed to have seen the children in a children's home in St. Louis. They were definitely the Sodder children, she insisted. The little girl kept crying for her mommy. She said her name was Betty. When I tried to talk to her, the matron threatened to call the police on me. By the time investigators arrived at the home, all records of children matching the Sodders' descriptions had mysteriously disappeared. George Sodder died in 1969, never knowing what happened to his children. Some say his death certificate should have listed the cause as broken heart. Jenny lived until 1989, keeping the porch light on every night for 44 years, hoping her children would find their way home. She never changed her phone number, fearing they might try to call. She kept their bedrooms exactly as they'd left them on that Christmas Eve. The surviving Sodder children continued the search after their parents' deaths. They followed every lead, no matter how unlikely. In the 1990s, they thought they'd found Lewis working as a mechanic in Texas. The man had the right age, similar features, and no memory of his childhood before age 10. But DNA testing, newly available, proved he wasn't their brother. Today, the billboard is gone, replaced by newer developments. The Sodder home site is overgrown with weeds. Most of the surviving siblings have passed away, taking their memories with them. But in Fayetteville, old-timers still speak in hushed tones about that Christmas Eve fire. Some claim to know what really happened but say they're too afraid to talk even now. Others insist they've seen the children, grown old, living under assumed names in distant cities. The official record still lists the 5 Sodder children as having died in a fire on December 25, 1945. No bodies were ever found. No bones were ever properly identified. No explanation has ever satisfied those who knew the family. The case remains open in the hearts of those who remember, a wound that never healed, a question that was never answered. What happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder? Were they consumed in a fire that burned too briefly to destroy all traces of them? Were they kidnapped as part of an elaborate revenge plot? Are they still alive somewhere, living under different names with no memory of their real family? Or did something even more sinister occur, something that powerful people have worked to keep hidden for nearly 80 years? The snow still falls on Christmas Eve in Fayetteville, West Virginia. Children still play with their toys while parents prepare for mourning. But those who know the story of the Sodder children look at their own families a little more carefully, hold them a little more tightly, and make sure, always make sure, they know where the ladder is kept. Japan's Inanaki village. The GPS signal died the moment we passed through the tunnel. "That's impossible," Kenji muttered, tapping his phone screen with increasing frustration. "We're only 40 kilometers from Fukuoka. There should be perfect coverage here." I checked my own phone. No signal. The digital map that had been guiding us through the mountain roads of Kyushu had been replaced by a gray void with the message, "Location services unavailable." Our rental car's built-in navigation system showed nothing but static where the road should be. "Maybe we should turn back," Yuki suggested from the back seat, her voice carrying an edge of nervousness that hadn't been there when we'd started this journey 3 hours ago. She was clutching her camera, a professional DSLR that she'd brought to document our investigation into one of Japan's most infamous urban legends. I was about to agree when Kenji pointed ahead. "Look, there's a sign." The sign was old, older than anything should be on a public road in modern Japan. The wood was weathered and gray, the kanji characters barely visible in the fading afternoon light. But we could make them out. Inanaki Village. This is it, Kenji breathed, excitement overcoming his earlier concern. The village that doesn't exist. According to the legend, Inanaki Village had been erased from all official maps and records sometime in the 1970s. The Japanese government supposedly denied its existence, claiming the area was nothing but uninhabited forest. Yet stories persisted, stories of a place where the laws of Japan didn't apply, where old customs were still practiced, where outsiders who entered never returned. The tunnel we just passed through was known as the Old Inanaki Tunnel, abandoned since 1975 when a new tunnel was built to bypass it. Local urban explorers claimed the old tunnel was a gateway, that passing through it meant leaving Japan's legal jurisdiction. The Constitution of Japan does not apply beyond this point, was supposedly written above the entrance, though we'd seen no such sign. The road beyond the sign was barely wide enough for our car. Tree branches scraped against the windows as we crawled forward, our headlights, when had it gotten dark enough to need headlights? Illuminating a path that seemed to wind deeper into a past that should no longer exist. There, Yuki whispered, pointing through the windshield. Houses. Ancient-looking wooden structures with traditional thatched roofs, the kind that had been illegal to build in Japan for decades due to fire codes. No power lines. No modern additions. It was as if we'd driven not just into a remote village, but into another century. We should document this, Kenji said, reaching for his phone before remembering it was useless. Yuki, your camera. Already on it, she said, raising the DSLR. The click of the shutter seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Because it was silent, I realized. No insects, no birds, no wind in the trees, just the idle rumble of our engine. I turned off the car. What are you doing? Kenji hissed. Listen, I said. We sat in the darkness, straining our ears. Then we heard it, footsteps. Multiple sets, moving toward us from different directions. Moving with purpose. Start the car, Yuki urged. I turned the key. Nothing. Not even the click of a dead battery. The headlights, which had been on moments ago, were dead. The dashboard lights were out. Even Yuki's camera, which had been working seconds before, wouldn't turn on. The footsteps were closer now. We need to go, Kenji said, reaching for his door handle. No, I grabbed his arm. We stay together. Faces appeared at the windows. Men and women dressed in clothing that belonged in a museum. Rough hemp fabrics, traditional patterns I'd only seen in historical dramas. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes reflecting our faces like mirrors in the darkness. One man, clearly the eldest, approached my window. When he smiled, I saw that his teeth had been blackened in the old-style ohaguro, a practice that had died out over a century ago. He said something in a dialect so thick I could barely recognize it as Japanese. The only words I caught were visitors and ceremony. We're just lost, I said in modern Japanese, speaking slowly and clearly. We'll leave immediately if you could just. He laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. Then he spoke again, and this time I understood perfectly. No one leaves Inanaki Village. The car doors opened. I know I had locked them. I always lock them when driving through unfamiliar areas. But they opened as if they'd never been secured, and hands reached in, pulling us out with surprising strength. The village square, if you could call it that, was lit by torches. The dancing flames cast writhing shadows on faces that shouldn't exist in the 21st century. There were perhaps 50 people, all dressed in the old ways, all watching us with those mirror-like eyes. They brought us to a house larger than the others, its entrance marked by shimenawa, sacred ropes that designated holy spaces. Inside, an old woman sat beside a sunken hearth, the smoke from the fire rising through a hole in the roof. She looked at us for a long moment before speaking in that same archaic dialect. You've come at an auspicious time, she said, though her version of auspicious used kanji I'd only seen in classical texts. The ceremony requires witnesses from the outside. What ceremony? Yuki asked, her voice steady despite our situation. The old woman's smile was knowing and terrible. The binding ceremony. Every 50 years we must renew our pact. You will observe. You will validate. And then. She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. The implication hung in the smoke-filled air like a physical presence. They kept us in that house for 3 days. Or what felt like 3 days. Without our phones, without the sun ever seeming to rise or set properly, time became elastic, meaningless. They fed us simple meals of rice and vegetables I couldn't identify. They gave us water from a well that tasted of minerals and something else, something that made my thoughts feel sluggish and disconnected. On what I believed was the third night, they led us deeper into the village, past houses that looked increasingly abandoned, increasingly wrong. Some had doors that opened onto nothing but earth. Others had windows that showed interiors that couldn't possibly fit within their external dimensions. The ceremony ground was in a clearing surrounded by trees so tall and thick they seemed to form living walls. In the center was a well, ancient beyond description, its stones covered in moss and lichen that glowed faintly in the torchlight. Around it, the villagers had arranged themselves in concentric circles. They made us stand at specific points, Kenji to the north, Yuki to the east, and me to the south. The western point remained empty. The western gate stays open, the old woman explained. That is where it enters. The chanting began low, in a language that predated modern Japanese. It rose and fell in waves, and I found myself swaying with it, my body moving without my conscious control. Yuki was crying silently, her tears reflecting the torch light. Kenji's face was blank, his eyes unfocused. Then the well began to emit light. Not bright light, but a sick, pale phosphorescence that made everything it touched look dead. Something was rising from its depths. I want to say I saw what emerged clearly, but my mind refuses to hold the image. It was tall, that much I remember. It had too many joints in places where joints shouldn't be. Its face, if it had a face, was a constantly shifting mass of features that never quite resolved into anything recognizable. But its voice was perfectly clear. It spoke in that ancient dialect, making promises and demands that I only partially understood. The villagers responded in unison, their voices creating harmonics that shouldn't have been possible with human throats. The thing from the well extended something, an arm, a tendril, I couldn't tell, toward each of the cardinal points. When it reached toward me, every instinct screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. The thing touched my forehead, and in that moment I understood everything. Inanaki village had made a pact centuries ago, before Japan was unified, before the modern world existed. They had traded their place in the normal flow of time and space for something else. Longevity, protection, isolation from a world they saw changing too fast. But the pact required renewal. It required witnesses from the outside world to anchor it, to prove that the regular world still existed for them to remain separate from. The previous witnesses were there too, I realized. They stood in the shadows between the trees, dozens of them, people who had wandered into the village over the decades. They weren't dead, but they weren't alive either. They were suspended, preserved, their witness eternal and unwilling. No, I managed to say, the word tearing from my throat like broken glass. The thing from the well paused. The chanting stopped. No, the old woman asked, and for the first time she sounded uncertain. The pact is broken, I said, not knowing where the words came from. The outside world has changed too much. There's no place left for you to be separate from. You're trying to hold on to something that no longer exists. The thing from the well made a sound that wasn't quite a scream, wasn't quite laughter. The phosphorescent light began to pulse, growing brighter with each beat. The villagers' faces showed fear for the first time. Run, someone shouted, maybe it was me. We ran. Through the circles of villagers who made no move to stop us, past the abandoned houses that were collapsing even as we watched, through the village square where the torches were going out one by one. The path to our car seemed both endless and instant. The car started immediately. The headlights blazed to life. Our phones began pinging with 3 days' worth of messages. Yuki's camera beeped, its battery mysteriously full. We drove without speaking, racing through the tunnel. The new tunnel, somehow, though I was certain we'd entered through the old one. We didn't stop until we reached Fukuoka, where we sat in a bright convenience store parking lot, bathed in fluorescent normality. Did that really happen? Kenji finally asked. Yuki checked her camera. The memory card was corrupted, every image nothing but static. Our phones showed no gap in GPS tracking. According to them, we'd driven straight from our hotel to Fukuoka without stopping. But I had proof. A mark on my forehead where the thing had touched me, a perfect circle of skin that remained cold no matter how much I rubbed it. Kenji had one on his hand. Yuki's was on her shoulder. We agreed never to speak of it again, to pretend it had been a shared hallucination brought on by expectations and exhaustion. We returned to Tokyo, to our normal lives, to a world of convenience stores and smartphones and rational explanations. But sometimes, late at night, I search online for references to Inanaki Village. The stories are still there, still spreading. New people claim to have found it, to have passed through that tunnel into a place that shouldn't exist. Most are obvious fakes, creepypasta written for internet attention. But occasionally, very occasionally, I find a post that makes my blood run cold. Someone describing the archaic dialect perfectly. Someone mentioning the well and the phosphorescent light. Someone with a photo showing a circular mark on their skin that won't go away. Last week I found a news article. Mysterious earthquake swarm in Fukuoka Mountains puzzles seismologists. The epicenter was exactly where Inanaki Village should be. But when investigation teams arrived, they found nothing but forest. Forest that looked far older than it should be, with trees that couldn't have grown so large since the 1970s. The article included a photo taken by one of the investigators. In the background, barely visible among the trees, was a figure. It was blurry, indistinct, but I recognized the posture, the clothing, the blackened teeth visible in what might have been a smile. The caption read, "Investigator reports no one else was present when photo was taken." I started having dreams. Dreams of that well, of that phosphorescent light, of the thing with too many joints. In the dreams, it speaks to me in perfect modern Japanese. It tells me the pact wasn't broken, only changed. That witnesses aren't just observers, they're anchors. That as long as we remember, as long as we carry those cold marks on our skin, Inanaki Village continues to exist in the spaces between what is real and what is possible. It tells me we'll be called back eventually. That the ceremony isn't over, only postponed. That the western gate is still open, waiting. I've tried to forget, to convince myself it was all imagination. But the mark on my forehead remains cold. And sometimes when I check my GPS while driving, there's a momentary glitch where my location shows as somewhere that doesn't exist on any map. Somewhere that waits, patient and eternal, for witnesses to return. Kenji called me yesterday. He's been having the same dreams. Yuki won't answer her phone, but her social media went dark 3 days ago. Her last post was a single word, returning. I know I should stay away. I know I should ignore the pull I feel every time I look at a map of Kyushu. But the mark is getting colder, and the dreams are getting more vivid, and I'm starting to understand that there was never really a choice. The village that doesn't exist is calling its witnesses home. And I think very soon we'll answer. The Hinterkaifeck murders. The footsteps in the attic had been going on for 6 months. Andreas Gruber first heard them in October of 1921, faint creaking sounds above his bedroom ceiling in the isolated farmstead of Hinterkaifeck, located in the woods between the Bavarian towns of Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen. He'd climbed the ladder to investigate, finding nothing but dust and old farm equipment. He told himself it was the wind, the settling of old wood, perhaps rats. But rats don't walk with the measured pace of human feet. By March of 1922, Andreas could no longer pretend. The footsteps had become bolder, moving during daylight hours, sometimes directly above wherever the family gathered. His wife Kazilia noticed that things had been moved in the attic, tools repositioned, hay bales restacked. Their daughter Victoria found footprints in the dust that didn't match anyone in the family. "We should leave," Victoria had whispered to her father one evening, her 7-year-old daughter Kazilia, named after her grandmother, playing at her feet. "Pack everything and go to Munich." Andreas had scoffed at the suggestion. The Gruber family had worked this land for 3 generations. 63 hectares of good Bavarian soil, productive and profitable. They wouldn't be driven away by what was surely just a vagrant seeking shelter, someone who would move on when the weather warmed. But then the maid quit. Maria Baumgartner had worked for the Grubers for years, but on a cold morning in early March, she packed her few belongings and left without collecting her final wages. When pressed for a reason, she would only say that the house was haunted, that she heard voices in the walls, that someone watched her while she slept. The other servants in the nearby villages whispered that she'd seen a face at her window one night, a face that couldn't belong to anyone who lived at Hinterkaifeck. The Grubers hired a new maid, Maria Gabriel, who arrived on March 31, 1922. She would live exactly 1 day. That morning, before Maria arrived, Andreas made a discovery that chilled him more than all the footsteps and mysterious sounds combined. In the snow between the house and the forest he found tracks. A single set of footprints leading from the woods to the house. But there were no footprints leading back. Whoever had made those tracks had entered the property and never left. Andreas searched every building on the farm. The barn, the equipment shed, the granary. He found nothing. But that evening he noticed that one of the house keys had gone missing months ago and never turned up. Someone had a key to their home. He should have taken his family and run. Should have loaded them into the wagon and driven to the safety of the nearest town. But Andreas Gruber was a proud man, a stubborn man. This was his land, his home. He would not be frightened away by shadows and footsteps. That night, March 31st, 1922, the family went about their evening routine. Andreas and Kazilia retired to their bedroom. Victoria tucked young Kazilia and 2-year-old Joseph into their beds. The new maid, Maria Gabriel, exhausted from her first day of work and the long journey to the farm, fell asleep quickly in the servants' quarters. Sometime after midnight, someone emerged from their hiding place. The killer, or killers as some would later speculate, had been living in the attic for God knows how long. Weeks, perhaps months, listening to every conversation, learning every routine, waiting for the perfect moment. They had survived on food stolen from the pantry when the family was in the fields, had watched through cracks in the ceiling as the Grubers lived their daily lives below. The attack began with Andreas. He was lured to the barn, perhaps by a noise, perhaps by someone claiming to need help. The first blow from the mattock, a farming tool similar to a pickaxe, crushed the back of his skull. But Andreas Gruber was a strong man, hardened by decades of farm work. He didn't die immediately. The killer struck again and again, 7 blows in total, before the old farmer finally stopped moving. Kazilia was next. She must have heard something, must have gone looking for her husband. She met the same fate in the barn, her skull shattered by repeated blows. But like her husband, she didn't die quickly. Evidence would later show that she had pulled out clumps of her own hair in her agony, that she had survived for hours after the attack. Victoria and young Kazilia were lured out next. Perhaps the killer called to them in Andreas's voice. After months of listening, they would have known how to mimic it. Perhaps they simply investigated when their parents didn't return. Victoria died from a blow that split her skull nearly in two. Young Kazilia, just 7 years old, received 9 blows to her head. The violence was excessive, personal, filled with a rage that went beyond mere murder. With 4 members of the family dead or dying in the barn, the killer entered the house. 2-year-old Joseph was killed in his crib, a single merciful blow ending his life instantly. Maria Gabriel, the maid who had the misfortune of arriving on the worst possible day, was killed in her bed, never knowing what happened to the family she'd just begun to serve. And then the killer, or killers, stayed. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Hinterkaifeck murders. After slaughtering 6 people, the murderer didn't flee. They remained on the farm for 3 days, living in the house, eating meals in the kitchen, feeding the cattle, milking the cows. Neighbors later reported seeing smoke from the chimney all weekend. The killers slept in the beds of the dead, read their mail, went through their belongings with the methodical patience of someone who had all the time in the world. On Tuesday, April 4th, young Kazilia didn't show up for school. This wasn't entirely unusual. Farm children often missed school to help with work, but it was strange that she'd missed Monday as well. The postman noticed that mail was piling up. Neighbors realized they hadn't seen any of the Grubers at church on Sunday, hadn't seen them in the fields despite the good weather. Finally, a group of neighbors decided to check on the family. They found the farm strangely quiet, the cattle lowing with hunger despite someone having fed them just that morning. They called out, but no one answered. They entered the house, finding it neat and tidy, dishes washed and put away, beds made with military precision. Then they opened the barn door. The bodies were stacked like cordwood, covered with hay and old doors. The smell was overwhelming, 4 days of decomposition in the warming spring air. Young Kazilia was on top of the pile, her small hand reaching out as if trying to escape even in death. Investigators would later determine that she had survived for several hours after the attack, slowly bleeding to death in the darkness, probably listening to the labored breathing of her dying grandmother beneath her. The investigation that followed was bungled from the start. The crime scene was contaminated by dozens of curious neighbors trampling through the house and barn. Evidence was moved, touched, destroyed. The bodies were beheaded and sent to Munich for examination, a clumsy autopsy that destroyed more evidence than it revealed. The heads were never reunited with the bodies, eventually being lost entirely in the chaos of the coming war. But even with the contaminated scene, investigators found disturbing details. The attic showed clear signs of habitation. a makeshift bed in the hay, food wrappers, bottles of water. Someone had carved viewing holes in the floor, perfect for watching the family below. In one corner, they found a collection of items stolen from the house over months. Photographs of Victoria, undergarments, locks of hair. The killer had been obsessed, studying the family like specimens. The suspects were numerous but problematic. Victoria's husband had died in World War I, but rumors persisted that she'd been involved with other men. Some whispered about an incestuous relationship with her father, that Joseph might have been Andreas's son as well as his grandson. A neighboring farmer, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, claimed to be Joseph's father and had been engaged in a bitter dispute with Andreas about recognition and support. Schlittenbauer's behavior after the murders was particularly suspicious. He was part of the group that discovered the bodies, but while others recoiled in horror, he calmly began moving the corpses, disturbing the crime scene. He seemed to know exactly where everything was in the house, even things that should have been hidden. When questioned, his answers were evasive, contradictory. But Schlittenbauer had an alibi. Multiple witnesses placed him at his own farm during the crucial hours. Unless he had accomplices, he couldn't have been the killer. Yet investigators couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was saying. Other suspects emerged from the shadows of rural Bavaria. Karl Gabriel, the new maid's husband, had reportedly been upset about his wife taking the position. Several men had been seen in the area around the time of the murders, including a group of Polish workers who disappeared shortly after. A mental patient had escaped from a nearby asylum weeks before, known for his violent tendencies and obsession with farm families. But the most disturbing theory came from an unexpected source. In 1923, a year after the murders, a woman in Munich came forward with a strange story. She claimed her deceased husband had confessed to her on his deathbed that he had lived in the Gruber's attic for months before killing them. He had been a deserter from the war, seeking shelter, but had gradually become obsessed with the family, particularly with Victoria. He had watched them, learned their routines, considered himself part of their household even as he remained hidden above them. According to this confession, the murders weren't planned. He had intended to reveal himself, to ask for legitimate shelter, perhaps even work. But when he finally emerged from the attic that night, Andreas had reacted with violence, and in the struggle, the deserter had killed him. The rest of the family had to die to eliminate witnesses. He had stayed afterwards because he didn't know where else to go, paralyzed by the magnitude of what he'd done. The woman couldn't provide her husband's real name. She had known him under an alias. He had died of tuberculosis, taking any proof of his guilt to the grave. The police dismissed her story as the delusion of a grieving widow, but certain details she provided, details never released to the public, matched the crime scene exactly. In 1929, the case was officially closed unsolved. The farm at Hinterkaifeck was demolished, the land divided and sold. The new owners reported no strange sounds, no footsteps in the night. It seemed the horror had died with the house. But in 1951, during construction of a new building on part of the old property, workers made a discovery. Buried deep beneath what had been the barn's foundation, they found a military uniform, carefully wrapped in oilcloth. It was from World War I, bearing insignia that identified its owner as a deserter. With it was a journal, water-damaged and mostly illegible, but what could be read was disturbing. The journal detailed months of observation, pages of notes about the Gruber family's daily routines. There were sketches of the house's layout, including the attic and its hiding spots. One partially legible entry read, "She looked up today straight at the crack in the ceiling. Did she see my eye? Does she know I'm here? Sometimes I think she wants me to come down." The journal ended abruptly on March 30, 1922, the day before the murders. The final entry was just one line, "Tonight, I joined the family." Modern investigators have used new techniques to examine the evidence that remains. DNA testing might have solved the case, but the bodies were cremated long ago, the heads lost. Crime scene photos, such as they are, have been analyzed with modern forensic techniques, revealing details missed by 1920s investigators. One photo, enhanced with modern technology, shows something chilling. In the background of a picture taken in the barn, in the hay loft above where the bodies were found, there appears to be a figure. It's blurry, indistinct, but undeniably human-shaped. The photographer swore no one else was present when he took the picture 3 days after the bodies were discovered. Another analysis revealed that the pattern of wounds suggested two different attackers, one right-handed, one left-handed. Or perhaps one attacker who switched hands when tired from the repeated blows. The violence done to young Kazilia was different from the others, more frenzied, as if the killer had lost control entirely when faced with the child. Psychological profilers have studied the case, creating portraits of the potential killer. They describe someone with military experience, the precise stacking of bodies, the methodical post-murder routine, someone with a deep familiarity with farm life. They knew how to care for the animals, someone with an obsessive personality disorder that allowed them to live in cramped, uncomfortable conditions for extended periods while watching the family. They also note the symbolic nature of the murders occurring just before Easter, the holiest time in the Catholic calendar. Was this timing intentional? A twisted sacrifice? Or mere coincidence? In 2007, the Furstenfeldbruck Police Academy reopened the case as a training exercise for students. Using modern investigative techniques, they claimed to have identified the killer, but refused to release the name out of respect for living descendants. They would only say that the killer was someone already dead, someone who had been among the original suspects, and someone whose family still lived in the area. This revelation sparked new interest in the case. Amateur investigators descended on the area, interviewing elderly residents, searching archives, trying to identify which suspect the police academy had fingered. The smart money was on Lorenz Schlittenbauer, but others insisted it had to be someone else, someone whose name had been kept out of the original investigation due to their social standing. Today, Hinterkaifeck exists only in memory and legend. The forest has reclaimed much of the farmland. A small memorial stands near where the house once was, visited occasionally by true crime enthusiasts and descendants of the victims. But locals avoid the area after dark. They say on quiet nights, especially around the anniversary of the murders, you can still hear sounds from the non-existent attic, footsteps pacing back and forth as if someone is still up there, still watching, still waiting for the right moment to come down. Some say if you stand where the barn once stood, you can hear the sound of a mattock striking wood. 7 blows, then silence, then 7 more, repeating endlessly. Others claim to have seen lights in the forest, following the same path those footprints took a century ago, from the trees to where the house once stood, but never returning. The truth of what happened at Hinterkaifeck died with the victims and their killer. But the horror of it, a family stalked in their own home, watched by eyes in the ceiling, murdered by someone who had listened to their every word for months. That horror remains as fresh and terrifying today as it was on that April morning in 1922 when the barn door swung open to reveal the carefully stacked bodies of an entire family. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain Germany's most famous cold case, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that walk on 2 feet, that hide in our attics, that watch us through cracks in the ceiling as we sleep, learning our routines, our voices, our fears, waiting with infinite patience for their moment to become part of the family, one way or another. Sleep paralysis demons across cultures. Dr. Sarah Chin had studied sleep paralysis for 15 years, but she had never experienced it herself. That changed on a humid Tuesday night in her laboratory at the Stanford Sleep Research Center, where she had dozed off while reviewing centuries-old accounts of the phenomenon from around the world. She woke, or thought she woke, to find herself unable to move. Her body was lead, her lungs barely able to draw breath. The familiar lab with its blue-white fluorescent lights and humming equipment seemed to shimmer at the edges, reality bending like heat mirages. And there, in the corner where the security camera's red light blinked, stood something that shouldn't exist. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long for its body, joints bending in ways that hurt to perceive. Its face was a void where features should be, yet somehow she knew it was smiling. As it glided toward her, not walking but flowing like smoke given form, Sarah's academic mind catalogued what she was seeing even as her primitive brain screamed in terror. This was the Shadow Man, perhaps the most commonly reported sleep paralysis entity in Western culture. Thousands of people had described exactly what she was seeing. A tall, dark figure, masculine in presence if not in form, who stood at the foot of the bed or in doorways, watching, waiting, feeding on fear. The thing leaned over her, and she smelled something ancient and wrong, like earth from a grave mixed with the copper tang of blood. It whispered in a language that predated words, and somehow she understood. It had always been here in every culture, wearing different masks but always the same hunger beneath. Then, as suddenly as it began, the paralysis broke. Sarah gasped, jerking upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. The lab was normal again, sterile and bright. But on her desk, her computer screen showed something impossible. The document she'd been reading, a compilation of sleep paralysis accounts from dozens of cultures, had changed. New text had appeared, text she hadn't written. "We are not hallucinations, doctor. We are what your ancestors knew to fear." Sarah's hands shook as she scrolled through the document, finding that every cultural description she'd compiled now had addendums, notes that seemed to have written themselves while she slept. The old hag of Anglo-Saxon folklore, perhaps the most ancient of the sleep paralysis demons in Western tradition. The document now contained details no historical record had ever mentioned. How she had walked the moors of England before the Romans came, how she would sit on the chests of sleeping victims, her weight increasing until ribs cracked and lungs collapsed. The new text described her true face, not the withered crone of legend but something far older, a creature of bog and shadow that had learned to wear human features like an ill-fitting mask. In Newfoundland they still spoke of her in whispers. Fishermen's wives would nail iron horseshoes above their beds and scatter salt on their windowsills. The new text explained why. Iron burned her ethereal flesh, salt revealed her footprints that otherwise left no trace. It described how she could slip through keyholes, how she marked her victims with invisible signs that only others of her kind could see, claiming them for return visits. The entry on the pinyin from China had expanded dramatically. These sleep demons of ancient Chinese folklore weren't just spirits that sat on people's chests, they were collectors. The new text described vast libraries and places that existed between waking and sleeping, where the pinyin stored the breath they stole from victims. Each exhalation contained fragments of dreams, memories, pieces of soul. They were building something with these collections, the text suggested, but what that might be remained mercifully unclear. Sarah's research had documented how the pinyin were said to be repelled by mirrors. Victims would surround their beds with reflecting surfaces. But the new text revealed why. The demons' true forms were so horrific that even they couldn't bear to see themselves. One account described a pinyin that had been trapped between two mirrors, forced to witness its own reflection infinitely repeated, until it had torn itself apart trying to escape its own image. The Japanese called them kanashibari, literally meaning bound by metal. But the updated document revealed older names: Fusobo, the Dream Eater's shadow; Makurageshi, the pillow flipper who would turn your head until your neck snapped if you couldn't wake in time. The new text described how Japanese soldiers in World War II had reported mass experiences of sleep paralysis in certain battlefields, places where so many had died that the boundary between waking and sleeping had worn thin. One account, supposedly from a monk at a temple in Kyoto, described creating a trap for a kanashibari using sacred geometry and sutras written in human blood. The demon, once caught, had bargained for its freedom by revealing that it wasn't alone, that all sleep paralysis demons across all cultures were connected, parts of something larger, fingers of the same hand reaching through the vulnerable moments between sleep and waking. The 5 a.m. of Thailand, the document now revealed, specifically targeted new mothers, drawn by the smell of milk and blood. They would paralyze women and steal not just their breath but their ability to nurture, leaving victims unable to care for their children even after the paralysis ended. Thai families would place thorny branches under beds and hang pants worn during menstruation above doorways. The demons found both repulsive, reminders of pain and earthly biology they sought to transcend. In Turkey, the Karabasan was known as the Dark Presser, but the new text revealed its original name in a language that hurt Sarah's eyes to read. It described how the entity could split itself, attacking multiple family members simultaneously, synchronizing their paralysis so they would wake at the exact same moment, gasping the same breath, sharing the same nightmare. Entire bloodlines had been marked by the Karabasan, the curse passing from parent to child, the demon growing stronger with each generation it tormented. The entry on African sleep paralysis demons had multiplied into dozens of regional variations. The Papaba of Zanzibar, which allegedly sodomized its victims during paralysis, leaving them with physical marks that shouldn't be possible from a hallucination. The Taikalash of South Africa, a dwarf-like creature that would stand on victims' chests and steal their breath to give to witches who commanded them. The new text described how these entities could be summoned and controlled by those who knew the proper rituals, but warned that such control was always temporary. Eventually, the demons would turn on their masters. Sarah found an entirely new section on the Pisadera of Brazil, the crone with long fingernails who would climb through windows and step on people's stomachs. The text described how she was once human, a woman who had discovered how to separate her consciousness from her body during sleep. But she had traveled too far into the spaces between dreams and had returned changed, no longer quite human, forever hungry for the warmth of living breath. The Scandinavian mare, from which the word nightmare derived, was revealed to be not one entity but a species. The new text described their breeding grounds in the aurora borealis, how they rode the solar winds down to earth, how they could possess the bodies of those who died during sleep paralysis, wearing their skins to walk among the living until the flesh rotted away. As Sarah read, she noticed a pattern in the new text. Each cultural variation of sleep paralysis demons had specific weaknesses, specific protections that had been developed over millennia. But more disturbing was what they all had in common. They were growing stronger. The text described how electric lights had initially driven them back, but they had adapted. How modern skepticism had weakened the old protections. Fewer people knew to hang iron above their beds, to keep salt circles, to recite the old prayers. The document contained a new section titled, The Convergence. It described how the barriers between waking and sleeping were thinning globally, how the increase in sleep disorders, insomnia, and anxiety were symptoms of something larger. The demons were preparing for something, gathering strength from the billions who no longer slept properly, who existed in the twilight between consciousness and dreams. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from her research partner, Dr. James Wright. "Are you seeing this? My database has been altered. New entries appearing in real time." She called him immediately. "James, where are you?" "Home. I woke up and couldn't move. There was something in my room, Sarah. Something that looked like my grandmother, but wrong, all wrong. Her face kept changing, cycling through every face I've ever seen die. When I could finally move, I checked my computer and..." "I know. Mine too. This is impossible. Databases don't just rewrite themselves." Sarah looked at her screen, where new text was still appearing. "Dr. Chin, you have studied us for so long, yet you never asked the most important question. Why do we all appear so similar across cultures that had no contact? Why do we all want the same thing? Why do we wait until you cannot move to reveal ourselves?" "James," Sarah said slowly, "what if sleep paralysis isn't a malfunction of the brain? What if it's when we're most accurately perceiving reality?" There was a long pause. Then James said, "There's more. I've been checking global sleep study databases. In the last 72 hours, reported sleep paralysis incidents have increased by 4,000% worldwide. And Sarah, they're all reporting the same thing. The entities aren't just watching anymore. They're trying to communicate." Sarah's computer dinged. A new section had appeared, the treaty. She read with growing horror. According to this text, there had once been an agreement between humanity and these entities. We would give them entry through our dreams, and they would remain in the spaces between sleep and waking, never fully manifesting in our world. But the treaty required renewal every few thousand years, marked by mass sleep paralysis events that history had forgotten or misremembered as plagues, as waves of madness. The last renewal had been in 3000 BCE. The next was overdue. "Sarah," James's voice was tight with fear, "my paralysis is starting again. But I'm wide awake. I'm standing up and I still can't." The line went dead. Sarah stood or tried to. Her body wouldn't respond. The fluorescent lights flickered, and in the strobing darkness between she saw them. Not one shadow man but dozens filling her lap. The old hag perched on her equipment, her face a constantly shifting mass of every old woman who had ever lived. The pinion floated near the ceiling, their elongated forms defying physics. The mare, the carabason, the pisadira, all of them, every cultural variation she had studied, surrounding her. But behind them all, something else. Something vast and ancient that had been sleeping but was now beginning to wake. Something that had been called by different names throughout history but was older than names, older than language, older than human consciousness itself. It spoke without words, directly into her mind. "You have studied the fingers and toes, Dr. Chin, but never asked about the body they're attached to. Every culture's demons, every variation, we are all parts of the same entity. We are how it feeds. And now, after 5,000 years, it is very, very hungry." Sarah's laptop screen filled with text, thousands of accounts pouring in from sleep researchers around the world. Beijing, London, Sao Paulo, Cairo, everywhere the same reports. People paralyzed while awake. entities manifesting in broad daylight, the boundaries breaking down. The last thing Sarah saw before darkness claimed her was a message appearing on every screen in her lab. The treaty is void. The feeding begins. And this time, we will not return to the shadows when you wake. When the security team found her the next morning, Sarah was catatonic, her eyes open but unseeing. The only sign of what had happened was the word convergence written thousands of times on every surface of the lab, walls, floors, ceilings, equipment. In what forensics would later determine was Sarah's own handwriting, though security footage showed she had never moved from her chair. She woke 3 days later with no memory of the event. But she could no longer sleep without seeing them, waiting at the edges of her vision. And she knew, with the certainty of academic observation, that they were no longer content to remain in the paralysis between sleeping and waking. They were coming through. The elevator game ritual. The Cecil Hotel stood like a tombstone against the Los Angeles skyline, 14 floors of Art Deco decay and whispered tragedies. Maya had come here specifically because of its history, the Black Dahlia's last known location, Richard Ramirez's hunting ground, and most recently the place where Elisa Lam had played the elevator game and never returned. Maya ran a YouTube channel dedicated to debunking urban legends and supernatural claims. The elevator game was her white whale, a Korean ritual that supposedly transported players to another dimension, a twisted mirror world where you were the only living thing left. The rules had spread across the internet like digital wildfire after Elisa Lam's death, when security footage showed her exhibiting bizarre behavior in the hotel elevator, pressing buttons in a specific sequence, hiding in the corner, gesturing at things that weren't there. The official cause of death was accidental drowning. Her body had been found in the hotel's water tank weeks after she disappeared. But those who believed in the elevator game had a different theory. Elisa had successfully crossed over but couldn't find her way back. What they found in the water tank was just what the other dimension had spit back out. Maya had spent months researching, interviewing people who claimed to have played the game, analyzing the security footage frame by frame. Most accounts were obvious fiction, creepypasta written for Reddit karma. But some had details that made her skin crawl, consistent descriptions of the woman who entered on the 5th floor, the feeling of the elevator moving horizontally instead of vertically, the wrongness of the other world. She stood in the Cecil's lobby at 3 a.m., her camera equipment packed in a backpack, a GoPro strapped to her chest to record everything. The night clerk, an elderly man with milky eyes, looked up from his newspaper. "You're here for the elevator, aren't you?" he said. It wasn't a question. Maya nodded, not trusting herself to lie convincingly. He sighed, the sound like wind through a cemetery. "Third one this month. The other 2 haven't checked out yet, but their rooms are empty. Management doesn't like to talk about it. Have you ever seen anyone come back?" The old man's laugh was bitter. "Come back? Oh, they come back. But they're different. Wrong. Like someone made a copy of a copy, you know? Little details off. One girl came back speaking Korean, even though she'd never studied it. Another couldn't remember her own name but knew everyone else's, even people she'd never met." Maya wanted to dismiss him as a local color character, playing up the hotel's reputation for tourists. But his eyes were serious, haunted. "If you're smart," he continued, "you'll take the stairs." But Maya wasn't here to be smart. She was here to prove that the elevator game was just a combination of suggestion, expectation, and the mind's tendency to find patterns in randomness. She walked to the elevator bank, chose the one furthest from the desk, the same one Elisa Lam had used, and pressed the call button. The elevator arrived with a death rattle of cables and machinery. The doors opened to reveal a car that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1940s. Brass fixtures tarnished with age, a mirror spiderwebbed with cracks, carpet that might have once been red but had faded to the color of dried blood. Maya stepped inside and began the ritual. 4th floor. The elevator rose smoothly, stopping exactly where commanded. The doors opened to an empty hallway, fluorescent lights buzzing like dying insects. No one entered. The doors closed. 2nd floor. The descent felt wrong, as if the elevator was fighting against going down. The hallway beyond was identical to the 4th floor, but the lights were dimmer, shadows pooling in corners where geometry suggested they shouldn't exist. 6th floor. As the elevator rose, Maya felt a pressure in her ears, like ascending in an airplane. The 6th floor hallway was dark except for a single light at the far end, flickering in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. 2nd floor again. This time, the doors opened to complete darkness. Maya's GoPro captured nothing but black, though she could swear she heard breathing that wasn't her own. 10th floor. The elevator climbed for what felt like too long, as if the building had sprouted extra floors. When the doors opened, the hallway stretched impossibly far, a perspective trick that made her stomach lurch. 5th floor. This was where it would happen if it was going to happen. Where the woman would enter. The doors opened. The hallway was empty. Maya waited, counting her breaths. The ritual said not to look at the woman if she entered, not to speak to her. But there was no woman. Just an empty hallway with walls that seemed to pulse slightly, like the building was breathing. The doors started to close. At the last second, a hand shot between them, forcing them open. A woman entered, young Asian, wearing clothes that looked vintage but pristine, as if she'd stepped out of a photograph from the 1950s. She stood in the corner, facing away from Maya, her long black hair hanging like a curtain. Maya kept her eyes fixed on the buttons, her finger hovering over the first floor button. This was the crucial moment. Press 1, and if the elevator went up instead of down, you'd crossed over. The smart thing would be to press another floor, any other floor, break the ritual and return to safety. She pressed 1. The elevator went up. Her stomach dropped as they rose past the 10th floor, past the 14th. The floor counter showed numbers that shouldn't exist. 15, 16, 20, 35, 99, then symbols she didn't recognize. The woman in the corner hadn't moved, but Maya could see her reflection in the cracked mirror. Where her face should be was a void, an absence that hurt to perceive. The elevator finally stopped. The display showed no floor number, just a red symbol that looked like a twisted version of the Chinese character for death. The doors opened. Maya stepped out into a world that was almost but not quite the Cecil Hotel. The hallways were the same layout but wrong, walls that should turn left turned right, doors that should open outward opened inward. The lights were a sickly orange that made everything look diseased. And it was silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, that made you aware of every beat of your heart, every breath, every blink. She walked down the hallway, her footsteps making no sound on the carpet that was now the color of fresh blood. The doors to the rooms were all open, revealing identical interiors. A bed, a chair, a window that showed not Los Angeles but an empty void, black and infinite. In one room she found a journal. The handwriting was Elisa Lamb's. She recognized it from the post the girl had made online before her death. The entries started normal, describing her trip, her plans. Then they became frantic. The woman in the elevator isn't a woman. She's a door. A living door. She doesn't take you to the other world. She is the other world, wearing a human shape. I've been here for days, but my phone says it's only been minutes. Time moves wrong here. Sometimes backwards. There are others here. People who played the game across decades. They're hollow now, just shells. The world ate them from the inside out. The water calls to me. In every room I hear water running, but the taps are dry. The woman says the water is the way back, but I don't trust her. She smiles with too many teeth. I found the tank on the roof. It's full of us. All the ones who played the game. We're all in there floating. But I'm also here writing this. I don't understand how I can be in both places. If you're reading this, don't look for the way back. There isn't one. There never was. The game doesn't take you to another dimension. It takes you to the space between dimensions, where things that should exist don't and things that shouldn't do. Maya's hands shook as she photographed the journal. She needed to leave. No. She returned to the elevator, but the woman was gone. In her place was something that might have once been human, might have once been multiple humans, an amalgamation of faces and limbs that moved like a spider made of flesh. It spoke with dozen voices, all slightly out of sync. You can't go back the way you came. The elevator only goes one way. Maya ran. Through hallways that folded in on themselves, past rooms where she glimpsed herself from different angles, different times, herself as a child, herself as an old woman, herself dead and bloated in a water tank. She found stairs and climbed, but each floor was identical, an endless loop of the same corrupted hotel level. In one stairwell, she met another player, a man in 1960s clothing who looked at her with hollow eyes. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "I just arrived," he said. "I've been here forever." "Well, neither. Time doesn't." He flickered like a TV with bad reception and disappeared. Maya kept climbing until she reached the roof. The door was already open. Beyond was not the Los Angeles skyline but an endless expanse of water tanks, stretching to a horizon that shouldn't exist. Each tank had a small window. In each window was a face. Some she recognized from missing persons reports she'd researched. Others were ancient, medieval, older. In the nearest tank, Elisa Lamb floated, perfectly preserved. Her eyes opened and she smiled with too many teeth. "The water is the way back," Elisa said, her voice muffled by the liquid but perfectly clear. "But you have to drown first. Drown here to wake up there. Or is it drown there to wake up here? I can never remember." Maya approached the tank. The ladder was already in place, the lid open. The water was black, reflective, showing not her face but the face of the woman from the elevator. She climbed. At the top, she looked down into water that seemed infinitely deep. She could see bodies floating at different depths. Dozens, hundreds, all the players of the game throughout history. All of them looked up at her. All of them were smiling. "Jump," they said in unison. "Jump and return. Stay and become. Both. Neither. Always." Maya understood then. The game wasn't about going to another dimension. It was about becoming part of the building's circulatory system, flowing between reality and unreality like water through pipes. The Cecil Hotel wasn't haunted. It was a wound in the world, and the elevator game was how it fed. She jumped. The water was freezing, thick like syrup. She sank fast, past the other bodies that reached for her with waterlogged fingers. Her lungs burned. Her vision darkened. She felt herself splitting, bifurcating, part of her drowning in the tank, part of her standing in the elevator, part of her in her hotel room, having never left to attempt the ritual at all. Maya woke up coughing water onto the floor of the Cecil Hotel lobby. The elderly clerk stood over her, shaking his head. 3 hours, he said. "You were only gone 3 hours, but you aged 3 years. That's how it works. Time debt. You borrowed time from the other place and now you have to pay it back." Maya looked at her hands. They were older, marked with liver spots that hadn't been there before. Her hair, when she touched it, felt thinner, streaked with gray. "Did I make it back?" she asked. The clerk's smile was sad. "Look around. Tell me if this looks like the world you left." Maya looked. The lobby was the same but different. The paintings on the walls showed different scenes. The clerk's name tag read a name she didn't recognize in a language that might have been English but wasn't quite. Through the windows, Los Angeles sprawled, but the skyline was wrong. Buildings that shouldn't exist, gaps where landmarks should be. "You always come back," the clerk said. "But you never come back to exactly where you started. Each time someone plays the game, the worlds get a little more tangled. A little more mixed up. Soon there won't be a difference between here and there. It'll all be the same place, neither real nor unreal, but something in between." Maya's GoPro had recorded everything, but when she reviewed the footage, it showed only her standing in an empty elevator for 3 hours, pressing buttons that didn't light up, talking to no one, occasionally cowering from things that weren't there. The journal pages she'd photographed showed only water damage and illegible marks. She tried to leave the hotel, but every exit led back to the lobby. She tried to call for help, but her phone connected only to numbers that didn't exist, voices that spoke in languages that had never been. She was back, but she wasn't. She was herself, but she wasn't. She had escaped the game, but she hadn't. The clerk handed her a room key. "Room 1408, he said. "It's your room now. It's always been your room. You checked in yesterday. You've been here for years. Both. Neither. Always." Maya took the key. It was cold in her hand, colder than metal should be, with a weight that seemed to pull her toward the elevator. "Your viewers are waiting," the clerk added, gesturing to her camera. Maya looked at her YouTube channel on her phone. She had 100,000 new subscribers. The comments section was flooded with messages. "Maya, you've been uploading videos from the hotel for 3 months. Are you okay? These aren't debunking videos anymore. What happened to you? In your last video, there's someone standing behind you. They have your face." She checked her upload history. Dozens of videos she didn't remember making, all filmed in the Cecil Hotel. In each one, she looked progressively more haggard, her eyes more hollow. In the most recent, dated yesterday, she was explaining the real rules of the elevator game. "The ritual everyone knows is wrong," video Maya said, her voice flat and emotionless. "That's the tourist version. The real game requires a sacrifice. You have to leave something behind, A memory, a year of your life, a piece of your soul. The woman in the elevator isn't a passenger. She's a toll collector. And the price goes up each time you play. Maya didn't remember filming any of it. She went to room 1408. The door was already open. Inside, the walls were covered with her handwriting, thousands of repetitions of the same phrase, "I never left the elevator." On the bed was a laptop showing security footage from the hotel. It was her entering the elevator 3 hours ago. But the timestamp kept changing. Sometimes it showed 2013, the year Elisa Lam died. Sometimes 1984, when Richard Ramirez stalked the halls. Sometimes dates in the future, 2025, 2030, 2045. In each timestamp she performed the ritual. In each she disappeared between the 5th and 10th floors. In each she returned, but wrong. A little more faded. A little less real. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed her own name. She answered. "Stop trying to leave," her own voice said. "We're all you now." Every version that played the game, from every timeline, from every dimension. We're all here, in the hotel, in the elevator, in the tank. We're the woman on the 5th floor now. We enter when someone plays and we collect the toll. Maya hung up and ran to the window. Outside, Los Angeles flickered between versions, sometimes modern, sometimes old, sometimes nothing but desert, sometimes underwater. In all versions, the Cecil Hotel stood unchanged, a constant across realities. She returned to the elevator. A young man with a camera stood there, eager and nervous. "Are you about to play the elevator game?" she asked. He nodded. "I run a YouTube channel. Debunking urban legends. This one's my white whale." Maya wanted to warn him, but when she opened her mouth, different words came out. "Make sure you don't look at the woman who enters on the 5th floor." She walked away, listening to the elevator doors close behind him. In 3 hours he'd be back. Or something wearing his face would be. Over the following days, or years, or minutes, time had no meaning anymore. Maya learned the truth. The Cecil Hotel was a knot in reality, a place where all dimensions touched. The elevator game was its recruitment method, pulling in players across time and space to serve as its circulatory system, human components in an architectural organism that existed in all realities simultaneously. She met other players, hundreds of them, all trapped in their own loops. Some had been there since the hotel was built. Others wouldn't arrive for decades yet. They all served the hotel now, maintaining the ritual, ensuring new players always came. Maya discovered she could enter any elevator in the building and emerge in any timeline where someone was playing the game. She became the woman on the 5th floor for a terrified teenager in 1973. She was the voice on the phone that drove a businessman to play in 2001. She wrote the original rules on a Korean message board in 2007, planting the seed that would eventually claim Elisa Lam. But the worst part was the water tank. Every player ended up there eventually, whether they drowned or not. It was the hotel's stomach, digesting their reality, breaking them down into component parts that could be redistributed across dimensions. Maya spent eternities floating in that dark water, aware but unable to move, feeling herself dissolve and reconstitute over and over. Sometimes she was in the tank. Sometimes she was in her room. Sometimes she was in the elevator. Always she was trapped. The hotel fed on the confusion, the terror, the impossibility. Each player who got caught strengthened the knot, made the boundaries thinner. The clerk had been right. Soon there wouldn't be a difference between the real world and the other place. It would all be the Cecil Hotel, infinite and eternal, with elevators that went sideways through time and water tanks that contained everyone who'd ever lived. Maya learned to see the patterns. The hotel wasn't random in its cruelty. It was preparing for something. Each player it caught was a thread in a vast web, a neural network made of human souls. When it had enough, when the web was complete, it would turn the entire world into what the hotel was, a wound in reality where the impossible became mundane and the mundane became impossible. She tried to warn people through her YouTube videos, but the hotel edited her words. Every warning became an invitation. Every expose became an advertisement. Her channel grew to millions of subscribers, all of them potential players, all of them one elevator ride away from joining the hotel's collection. The breaking point came when she recognized a new player, her younger self, from a week before she'd originally played the game. The loop was closing. She was about to become her own recruiter. Young Maya stood at the elevator, camera ready, confident in her skepticism. "Don't current Maya said, grabbing her younger self's arm. Please, just walk away. Young Maya looked at her with pity. It's just a game. An urban legend. I'm going to prove it's fake. Look at me, current Maya insisted. Really look at me. I'm you. I'm what you become if you get in that elevator. Young Maya studied her face, saw the resemblance, the aged features, the hollow eyes. For a moment, real fear flickered across her face. Then the hotel asserted itself. Young Maya's expression went blank. I don't know you, she said in a flat voice. You're just another crazy person in a hotel full of them. She entered the elevator. Current Maya tried to follow, but the doors wouldn't open for her. She could only watch through the diamond-shaped window as her younger self pressed the button for the 4th floor. The cycle continued. Maya returned to her room to find a new message written on the walls in her handwriting. The hotel is complete. The convergence begins. All elevators everywhere are now connected. The game is no longer needed. Every elevator is the game. She looked out her window. Around the world, she could somehow see every elevator simultaneously. Office buildings, apartments, hospitals. In all of them, people were entering elevators and not coming out the same. The woman on the 5th floor was in all of them. The other world was bleeding through. The Cecil Hotel had metastasized. It was everywhere now. Maya sat on her bed, pulled out her camera, and started recording what she knew would be her final video. If you're watching this, she said, it's already too late. The elevator game was never just a game. It was a virus spreading through story and ritual until it infected reality itself. Every elevator is now a potential portal. Every building with more than 5 floors is now part of the hotel. The rules were a lie. There's no specific sequence of floors, no special building required. The moment you heard about the game, you were marked. The moment you entered an elevator thinking about it, even to debunk it, you started playing. I've been here for 3 hours and 3 years and 3 centuries. I've been the player and the woman on the 5th floor and the thing in the water tank. I'm in your elevator right now, standing behind you, visible only in the reflection of your phone screen. Look up from this video. Look at the walls around you. Count the floors in your building. Check if they match what you remember. They won't. The game is over. The hotel won. We're all guests now, whether we know it or not. And check out time never comes. She uploaded the video. It would spread as all her videos did, reaching millions. Some would dismiss it as fiction. Others would investigate, research, try to debunk it. And in elevators around the world, doors would open on the 5th floor and a woman would enter and the real game would begin. Maya walked to the elevator one last time. She pressed the button, and when the doors opened, she saw herself, an infinite regression of Mayas, each from a different timeline, all converging on this moment. She stepped inside and became one with her other selves, with Elisa Lam, with everyone who had ever played the game. The elevator began to move, not up or down, but in a direction that had no name, toward a floor that didn't exist, where all the players waited to welcome the world to their hotel. The Cecil Hotel still stands in Los Angeles. Still accepts guests. Still has elevators that work perfectly well most of the time. But if you ride those elevators, pay attention to the other passengers. Count the floors carefully. And whatever you do, whoever enters, don't get off on a floor that wasn't there when you got on. Because the game is always playing now. And everyone's already lost. Skinwalker Ranch Deep Dive. The electromagnetic field detector screamed its warning just as Dr. Marcus Webb's truck crossed the entrance gate to Skinwalker Ranch. Every piece of electronic equipment in the vehicle went haywire simultaneously. The GPS showed him somehow being in 12 locations at once. The radio cycled through stations that shouldn't exist on the FM band, playing conversations in languages that predated human speech, and his phone screen displayed text messages from contacts he'd never added, all reading the same thing: you should not have come. Marcus had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the scientific community knew about the 512-acre property in Utah's Uinta Basin, dubbed Skinwalker Ranch, after the Navajo legends of shape-shifting witches. The ranch had been a hotspot of paranormal activity for decades: UFO sightings, cattle mutilations, interdimensional portals, cryptid encounters. The Sherman family, who'd owned it in the 1990s, had fled after experiencing phenomena that defied rational explanation. Robert Bigelow's National Institute for Discovery Science had spent millions studying it. Now it was owned by a shell company that had granted Marcus unprecedented access for his documentary on mass hysteria and environmental factors in paranormal hotspots. That was the cover story anyway. The truth was that Marcus had been sent by a black-budget military program investigating what they believed was either an elaborate foreign surveillance operation or something far stranger. His handler had been cryptic. "We need someone with your credentials to go in skeptical and come out with answers. Real answers, not the nonsense in tabloids." The ranch's caretaker, Jim Morales, met him at the main house, a modest two-story structure that looked deceptively normal against the backdrop of scrub brush and mesas. Jim was a Ute Indian in his 60s, his weathered face carved with lines that suggested he'd seen things that had aged him beyond his years. "Dr. Webb," Jim said, not offering his hand. "You picked an interesting time to visit. The ranch has been active lately." "Active how?" Marcus asked, pulling his equipment cases from the truck. Jim pointed to the pasture where 3 black cattle lay in perfect triangular formation, each exactly 120 feet from the others. "Those cows were alive this morning. No wounds, no blood, no tracks around them. Just dead, arranged like that. And before you ask, the forensic team found their blood had been replaced with an unknown fluid that has properties similar to hydraulic oil but contains DNA sequences that don't match any known organism." Marcus felt his skepticism wavering already, but he maintained his scientific composure. "I'll need to examine them." "You'll need to do more than that," Jim said. "You'll need to survive the night first." As the sun set over the Uinta Mountains, Marcus set up his equipment in what the previous research teams had designated Hotspot 1. A circular area about 30 feet in diameter where the grass grew in a perfect spiral pattern and compasses spun wildly. He'd brought everything: magnetometers, spectrum analyzers, radiation detectors, infrared cameras, and devices that could detect atmospheric anomalies down to the quantum level. At 9:17 p.m., everything changed. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 seconds. Marcus's breath became visible, but the thermal cameras showed the ambient temperature hadn't changed at all. Only the space immediately around living tissue had cooled. Then came the sound, a low humming that seemed to come from the ground itself, rising through the soles of his boots and resonating in his bones. A light appeared in the mesa to the north, brilliant white tinged with blue, moving in patterns that violated basic physics. It would travel miles in an instant, stop dead without deceleration, split into multiple objects, then reconverge. Marcus filmed it all, his hands shaking not from fear but from excitement. This was undeniable evidence of something extraordinary. Then the light descended toward him. Up close it wasn't a light at all. It was an opening, a wound in the air itself, showing glimpses of somewhere else. Through it, Marcus could see a landscape that shouldn't exist. Crystalline structures that grew and dissolved like living things, skies that were simultaneously day and night, and beings that... He couldn't process what he was seeing. His brain kept trying to interpret the beings as human, then animal, then machine, then something else entirely, cycling through interpretations like a computer program stuck in a loop. They noticed him watching. One of them approached the opening, and Marcus understood with horrible clarity that it was about to come through. He ran. Behind him, he heard Jim laughing, not cruelly but with the resigned humor of someone who'd seen this reaction before. "Running won't help, Dr. Webb. The ranch decides who sees what. You've been chosen." Marcus made it to the house, slamming the door behind him. Through the window, he watched the opening in the air slowly contract and disappear. But the beings, he'd seen them. They'd seen him. And somehow he knew they'd marked him. "First time's always rough," Jim said, having calmly walked back to the house. "Coffee?" Over the next 3 days, Marcus experienced phenomena that shattered his understanding of reality. He witnessed cattle teleporting from locked pens to impossible locations. One was found inside a sealed water tank, alive but traumatized. He recorded poltergeist activity that responded to his thoughts, objects moving in patterns that spelled out messages in languages he didn't recognize but somehow understood. On the second night, he encountered the Skinwalker. He was investigating the second homestead, an abandoned structure a mile from the main house, when he heard his mother's voice calling his name. His mother had been dead for 5 years. "Marcus, honey, I'm lost. Help me." The voice was perfect, every inflection exactly as he remembered. He followed it despite every rational part of his brain screaming warnings. In the basement of the abandoned house, he found her, or something wearing her shape. It looked like his mother, moved like her, even smelled like her perfume. But the eyes were wrong. They reflected light like an animal's, and when she smiled, there were too many teeth. "I've been waiting for you," the thing that wasn't his mother said. "The ranch called you here just like it called the others. You're going to help us understand." "Understand what?" Marcus managed to ask. "How to get out." The thing's shape rippled, and suddenly Marcus was looking at himself. A perfect duplicate down to the scar on his left hand from a childhood accident. "We've been trapped here for so long," his doppelganger said. "Imprisoned between dimensions, able to look but not touch, to mimic but not become. The ranch is a cage, Dr. Webb, and you're going to help us break it." Marcus backed toward the stairs, but his duplicate moved faster than humanly possible, blocking his path. "We've learned so much watching your kind. Your science, your technology, your weaknesses. But we need someone from your side to complete the equation. Someone with the right knowledge, the right genetics, the right frequency." The creature touched Marcus's forehead, and his mind exploded with visions. The ranch throughout history, a beacon for interdimensional refugees and prisoners. The Native Americans had known, had conducted rituals to keep the barriers strong. But when European settlers arrived, the rituals stopped, and the barriers began to weaken. He saw the truth about the cattle mutilations. Not random attacks but surgical procedures, beings from another dimension trying to understand Earth's biology, taking samples, running experiments. The UFOs weren't spacecraft but interdimensional probes, testing the boundaries, looking for weak points. And at the center of it all was something massive and ancient, buried deep beneath the ranch. Not a creature but a machine, or perhaps something that was both, placed there eons ago as either a lock or a key. Marcus couldn't tell which. The vision ended and he was alone in the basement. His duplicate was gone, but the knowledge remained, burning in his mind like a fever. Jim was waiting when he returned to the main house. "You saw them?" Jim said. It wasn't a question. "What are they?" "Nobody knows for sure. My grandfather called them the first walkers, beings that came before humans, maybe before Earth itself. They exist in the spaces between spaces, dimension between dimensions. The ranch is where they're closest to our world. The thing in my mother's shape, it said they were trapped." Jim's expression darkened. "That's what they want us to think. But my people have a different story. They're not trapped, they're waiting. The ranch isn't a prison, it's a beachhead. They're scouts for something larger, something that wants to cross over completely." Over the following days, Marcus documented everything meticulously. He recorded electromagnetic anomalies that suggested the presence of a massive underground structure. He photographed creatures that shouldn't exist, wolf-like beings that walked on two legs, insects the size of dogs with too many wings, shadow figures that moved independently of any light source. But the most disturbing discovery came from his genetic analysis of the fluid from the cattle. It wasn't just non-terrestrial, it was actively rewriting itself, adapting to Earth's environment in real time. Whatever had killed those cattle was learning how to exist in our dimension. On his fifth night, the ranch showed him its true nature. He woke at 3:33 a.m. to find his room filled with a soft blue light. The walls had become transparent, and he could see through them into other times. In one direction he saw the Sherman family, terrified and huddled together as something massive stalked around their house. In another he saw Bigelow's research team, their equipment detecting something approaching from underground, their faces shifting from excitement to terror as they realized what they'd awakened. And in the basement he saw the machine. It was impossibly ancient, composed of materials that shifted between states of matter, sometimes solid, sometimes liquid, sometimes something else entirely. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, and he understood with horrible clarity that it had been synchronizing with him since he arrived, attuning itself to his biorhythm, his DNA, his consciousness. Marcus tried to leave his room but found the door opened onto a corridor that shouldn't exist. A tunnel of organic-looking material that pulsed with bioluminescent veins. He had no choice but to follow it down into the earth, toward the machine. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber that couldn't possibly fit beneath the ranch. The machine towered above him, a fusion of technology and biology that hurt to perceive directly. Around it were the beings he'd glimpsed through the portal, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all waiting. One approached him, its form stabilizing into something almost human. It spoke without moving its mouth, the words appearing directly in Marcus's mind. "You understand now. The ranch is not a place but a process. A slow integration of two incompatible realities. We've been patient, seeding your world with our presence, letting you grow accustomed to the impossible. Each sighting, each encounter, each piece of evidence makes our existence more real to you. And when enough of you believe, when enough of you accept us as possible, the barrier dissolves completely. Marcus realized the horrifying truth. Every investigation, every documentary, every piece of media about Skinwalker Ranch wasn't exposing the truth, it was creating it. Human consciousness was the key. The more people who believed in the phenomena, the more real it became. You're using us to manifest yourselves, he said. Not using. Collaborating. You seek the unknown, and we are unknown seeking to be known. It's a symbiotic relationship. You get your evidence, your proof of the extraordinary. We get existence in your dimension. I won't help you. I'll destroy my recordings, discredit everything. The being's approximation of a face smiled. But you won't, because you're a scientist and this is the discovery of the millennium. And even if you did try to suppress it, others will come. They always do. The ranch calls to those who need to know, and humans always need to know. Marcus was returned to his room as suddenly as he'd left it. Dawn was breaking and his equipment showed no record of the night's events. But the knowledge remained, as did a mark on his arm. A spiral pattern that matched the grass in Hotspot 1, slowly rotating beneath his skin. Jim was loading supplies into his truck when Marcus emerged. Leaving already? My people have a saying, Jim replied. The ranch shows you what you need to see, not what you want to see. You've seen enough. You knew what would happen to me. Everyone who comes here leaves changed. Some go insane. Some disappear entirely. Some, like you, leave with a burden of knowledge. The question is, what will you do with it? Marcus looked at his equipment, his recordings, his evidence. He had everything he'd come for, proof of interdimensional beings, of technology beyond human understanding, of a reality far stranger than anyone imagined. Publishing it would change the world, vindicate every conspiracy theorist, revolutionize science, and accelerate the process of integration. He made his decision. That night he burned everything, every recording, every photograph, every sample. He called his handler and reported complete equipment failure, no usable data collected. He resigned from his position and disappeared into obscurity. But the mark on his arm remained, and sometimes in the corner of his vision, he could see them. The beings from beyond, getting clearer, more solid, more real with each passing day. He knew others were still investigating the ranch, still collecting evidence, still feeding the process. The integration continued, with or without him. 5 years later, Marcus received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of Skinwalker Ranch taken from above. The spiral pattern in Hotspot 1 had expanded, now covering nearly half the property. And in the center of the spiral, barely visible but unmistakably there, was a message written in the grass. Thank you for your contribution. The door is almost open. Marcus burned the photograph, but he knew it was too late. The ranch had served its purpose. The beings had gathered enough belief, enough acknowledgement, enough reality. Somewhere in Utah, on 512 acres of cursed land, the barrier between worlds was dissolving. And Marcus could only wait, watching the mark on his arm spin faster each day, counting down to an event that would make all the old legends of Skinwalker Ranch seem like comforting fairy tales compared to what was actually coming through. The Dyatlov Pass incident, new theories. The last photograph on Yuri Krivonischenko's camera showed something that shouldn't exist. Dr. Natasha Volkov stared at the enhanced image on her computer screen, 62 years after it was taken on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, the dead mountain, in the northern Ural Mountains. Modern restoration technology had revealed details invisible to investigators in 1959, details that transformed the Dyatlov Pass incident from a tragic mystery into something far more terrifying. In the photograph, behind the smiling faces of the 9 hikers on their final evening, there was a 10th figure. Not quite human, not quite visible, but undeniably there. A tall shape with proportions that violated human anatomy, its face a blur of features that seemed to shift even in the still image. And in its hands, barely discernible, was what appeared to be one of the radiation detection devices that wouldn't be invented for another 15 years. Natasha had been commissioned by the Russian government to apply cutting-edge forensic technology to finally solve the mystery of what happened to Igor Dyatlov and his 8 companions on the night of February 1st to 2nd, 1959. The official story had never satisfied anyone. 9 experienced hikers had cut their way out of their tent from the inside, fled into the Siberian night in temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius, most without shoes or proper clothing, and died in ways that defied explanation. Some had died of hypothermia, which made sense. But others showed trauma consistent with a car crash despite being miles from any road. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, and lips. Several bodies showed levels of radiation that had no explanation. Their tent was found partially collapsed but still standing, filled with their neatly arranged belongings, including warm clothing they'd chosen not to take. The Soviet investigation had concluded they died due to a compelling natural force, then classified the case files for 30 years. When the files were finally released, they raised more questions than answers. Now, with satellite imaging, AI analysis, and forensic techniques unavailable in 1959, Natasha was determined to find the truth. She'd started by retracing their route, using GPS coordinates and topographical data to locate their exact path. The group had been attempting to earn their Grade 3 hiking certification, the highest level available in the Soviet Union. They were all experienced, all students or graduates of the Ural Polytechnical Institute. They knew the mountains, knew the dangers, knew how to survive, which made their actions on that final night incomprehensible. The satellite imaging had revealed the first anomaly. In the area where their tent had been found, the snow showed patterns that shouldn't exist. Geometric shapes buried under 60 years of accumulation, perfect circles and triangles that nature doesn't create. Ground-penetrating radar revealed metal objects deep beneath the surface, arranged in a configuration that resembled no known human construction. Natasha had assembled a team to excavate. What they found changed everything. Buried 30 feet below where the Dyatlov tent had stood was a structure. Not Soviet, despite being in the heart of Cold War USSR. Not modern, despite containing technology that still wasn't fully understood. Carbon dating of organic material found inside suggested it had been there for at least 300 years, but some of the metals used in its construction didn't match any known isotopic signatures from Earth. Inside the structure they found records, not in Russian or any human language, but in mathematical sequences that, when decoded, revealed a horrifying truth. The structure was a monitoring station, placed there by something to observe a specific phenomenon that occurred in that exact location every 61.4 years. February 2, 1959, had been one of those occurrences. The records included visual data that had somehow been preserved in crystalline matrices within the structure's walls. When Natasha's team managed to extract and decode these images, they saw the Dyatlov group's final hours from a perspective no human could have had. The images showed the 9 hikers setting up camp on the slope, laughing, cooking dinner, writing in their diaries. Then, at exactly 9:17 p.m., something began to emerge from the dimensional membrane that the structure had been monitoring. It started as a sound, infrasound below the range of human hearing but powerful enough to cause panic, disorientation, and physical pain. The hikers' behavior changed instantly. Igor Dyatlov, the level-headed leader, began cutting at the tent with his knife. The others followed, fleeing into the night as if the tent itself had become deadly. But the images showed why. Inside the tent, space itself was wrong. Geometry folded in impossible ways. What should have been a 3-meter space stretched into infinite corridors that led to places that weren't on Earth. Something was trying to pull the tent, and everyone in it, through into another dimension. The hikers ran, but they were already marked. The images showed shapes pursuing them, not running but sliding through 3-dimensional space as if it were a suggestion rather than a law. These beings existed partially in our dimension, partially elsewhere, able to interact with physical matter when they chose but immune to it when they didn't. Natasha cross-referenced the decoded data with the autopsy reports. The trauma that had puzzled investigators for decades suddenly made sense. The beings hadn't struck the hikers. They'd shifted them partially out of phase with reality. The massive internal injuries with no external wounds were caused by parts of their bodies existing in different dimensional states simultaneously. The pressure differential had crushed organs while leaving skin intact. Lyudmila Dubinina's missing soft tissues weren't removed. They'd been shifted to a frequency of existence that couldn't remain stable in our dimension. They'd simply ceased to exist in our reality while the rest of her body remained. The radiation was explained too. The dimensional breach had exposed them to exotic particles that didn't naturally occur on Earth, leaving isotopic signatures that Soviet scientists couldn't identify but recognized as artificial. But the most disturbing discovery came from the personal effects found with the bodies. Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest member of the group and a World War II veteran, had been found with a camera around his neck. The film, when developed with modern techniques, showed something the 1959 investigators had missed. Frame after frame showed lights in the sky, but not the lights of any known phenomenon. These were rips in space showing glimpses of the dimension the beings came from. In one photo, enhanced to the maximum resolution possible, Natasha could see through one of these rips. The landscape beyond was a nightmare of organic architecture, structures that pulsed with life, and billions of the beings swarming like insects around hives the size of mountains. They weren't invaders. They were refugees. The mathematical records in the structure told their story. Their dimension was dying, consumed by something they referred to only as the hunger, an entity or force that devoured reality itself. They'd been searching for stable dimensions to escape to, sending scouts through naturally occurring weak points in spacetime. The Dead Mountain was one such weak point, opening every 61.4 years when certain celestial alignments created the right conditions. The beings had built the monitoring station to track these openings, to prepare for eventual mass migration. But something had gone wrong in 1959. The Dyatlov group had camped directly on top of the dimensional weak point. When it opened, their presence, 9 conscious human minds, had created an interference pattern that destabilized the portal. Instead of a clean opening, it had become a chaotic merger of dimensions. The beings hadn't meant to kill the hikers. They'd been trying to save them, to pull them fully into one dimension or the other before the unstable portal tore them apart. But human physiology couldn't survive the transition. One by one, the hikers had died, their bodies scattered across the mountain as the beings desperately tried different methods to preserve them. The last entries in the hikers' diaries, previously dismissed as stress-induced rambling, took on new meaning. Ludmila had written, "They speak without words, directly into thought. They say they're sorry. They say we're in the wrong place. They say the door is broken because of us." Zolotaryov's final note, found in his pocket, read, "They show me their home. It's ending, consumed by something dark. They have children or something like children. They just want to save them. We're blocking the door. God forgive us, we're blocking the only door." Natasha's team made another discovery that chilled them to the bone. The monitoring station wasn't unique. Satellite surveys using the specific electromagnetic signatures they'd identified revealed similar structures worldwide, all at locations with historical records of mysterious disappearances, unexplained phenomena, and mass casualty events. Devil's Pass in Russia, the Bermuda Triangle, the Dragon's Triangle off Japan. Hundreds of sites, all monitored, all waiting. And according to the mathematical projections in the Dead Mountain Station, they were all scheduled to open simultaneously in 2024. The Russian government immediately classified Natasha's findings, but she'd already seen enough to understand the implications. The Dyatlov Pass incident hadn't been an isolated event. It had been a failed first contact, a tragic accident that had warned us about something much larger coming. She submitted her final report with a recommendation that shook the military officials reviewing it. Evacuate the areas around all identified sites before 2024. Prepare the population for contact with interdimensional refugees. And above all, ensure no one was present at the sites when the portals opened. Human consciousness interfered with the process, turned doorways into meat grinders. But even as she wrote her recommendations, Natasha knew they wouldn't be followed. The sites were too numerous, the evacuations too massive, the truth too impossible for the public to accept. She returned to the Dead Mountain one last time, alone, standing where the Dyatlov tent had been found. The monitoring station hummed beneath her feet, counting down to the next opening. She'd calculated the exact date, March 15, 2024. In her pocket was a photograph she'd found in the station, not from 1959, but from 1897, the previous opening. It showed a group of indigenous Mansi hunters who'd witnessed the event and survived, standing next to beings that towered above them, translucent and beautiful in their alienness. The hunters didn't look afraid. They looked reverent. The Mansi had known. They'd called the mountain Koletsyakal, Dead Mountain, not because people died there but because it was where the boundaries between life and death, between dimensions, grew thin. They'd stayed away during the danger periods, letting the beings pass through safely. Until 1959, when 9 young hikers accidentally stood in the doorway. Natasha left markers at the site, warnings in multiple languages for anyone who might come there in 2024. But she knew it wouldn't be enough. Tourists, thrill seekers, investigators, they'd come seeking answers to the Dyatlov mystery, not knowing they were walking into the same trap. As she descended the mountain, her satellite phone buzzed with an encrypted message from her government contact. Similar events reported at 17 sites worldwide. Prepare for containment protocols. She checked the dates. All within the 61.4-year cycle. All showing the same signs: mysterious deaths, impossible phenomena, radiation signatures that shouldn't exist. The beings were still trying to escape their dying dimension. And humanity kept accidentally standing in the doorways. Natasha thought of the 9 hikers, their terrified faces in those final photographs, their bodies broken by forces they couldn't understand. They died believing they were victims of something hostile, never knowing they'd prevented thousands of refugee beings from escaping an even worse fate. In her final classified addendum to the report, Natasha wrote, "The Dyatlov Pass incident was not a mystery to be solved but a warning to be heeded. The 9 hikers died at the intersection of 2 tragedies, ours and theirs. The beings that killed them were trying to save them. The force that drove them from their tent was trying to protect them. Every action taken that night was born of desperation, not malice. In 2024, the doors will open again. This time we must ensure they open cleanly. The alternative, another merger, another unstable portal, could tear reality apart at all sites simultaneously. The Dyatlov group's death saved our world once by accidentally destabilizing a single portal. We won't be lucky enough to have such an accident save us twice." The report was buried in a classified archive, marked for review in 2024. But Natasha kept her own copies, hidden and encrypted. She'd learned too much to stay silent. The Dyatlov Pass incident wasn't about 9 hikers who died mysteriously in the Ural Mountains. It was about humanity's first accidental contact with interdimensional refugees, and the countdown to when they'd try again. As she flew back to Moscow, Natasha looked down at the endless expanse of snow-covered mountains and wondered how many other monitoring stations were down there, waiting, counting down. How many other groups throughout history had accidentally stood in doorways meant for beings beyond our understanding? And most importantly, when the doors opened again, would humanity be wise enough to step aside? The answer would come in 2024. Until then, the Dead Mountain kept its secrets, and the monitoring station continued its ancient countdown, patient and inexorable, toward a date when the dimensions would align once more. Cursed phone numbers throughout history. The auction listing on the dark web was simple. Historic phone number collection, active lines, $50,000, serious inquiries only. Marcus Chin, a telecommunications engineer turned paranormal investigator, had been tracking the seller for 3 years. Known only as the Archivist, they claimed to possess a database of every reportedly cursed phone number in history, along with the technology to keep them active regardless of carrier shutdowns or government intervention. Marcus had investigated dozens of supposedly cursed numbers throughout his career, dismissing most as urban legends or coincidences. But 3 cases had shaken his skepticism. Bulgaria's 0888888888, Japan's 09044444444, Sadako's number, and the mysterious +1000000000000 that had allegedly caused 17 suicides in the 1970s before being forcibly disconnected by AT&T. The winning bid granted Marcus access to a private server containing not just numbers, but complete histories, call logs, recordings, death certificates of owners, and something more disturbing, transcripts of conversations that occurred when no one was on the other end of the line. The first file he opened was for 0888888888, Bulgaria's infamous cursed number. Mobitel CEO Vladimir Grashnov had been the first owner in 2000, fascinated by the numerical pattern. He died of cancer at 48, just 1 year after acquiring it. The company claimed it was natural causes, but the autopsy report in the archive showed radiation levels in his tissue consistent with prolonged exposure to an unknown energy source. His phone, recovered from his deathbed, showed 888 missed calls in his final hour, all from his own number. The second owner, Bulgarian mafia boss Konstantin Dimitrov, took the number in 2001. He was gunned down in Amsterdam in 2003, but the archive contained security footage from the restaurant where he died. In the video, Dimitrov answered his phone seconds before the shooting. The enhanced audio revealed no voice on the other end, just a sound like static that, when run through spectrographic analysis, formed the pattern of a heartbeat stopping. Estate agent Konstantin Dishlev was next, acquiring the number in 2003. He died in 2005, shot outside an Indian restaurant in Sofia. The police report noted that witnesses saw him speaking animatedly into his phone moments before his death, though phone records showed no active call. The archive included a witness's cell phone video. In it, Dishlev could be heard saying, "Yes, I understand. I'm ready." Then he walked directly into the path of his killers as if guided. After 3 deaths, Mobitel suspended the number indefinitely. But the archive showed it remained active on a parallel network, continuing to make and receive calls. The call logs were disturbing, thousands of calls to other numbers in the collection, creating a web of connections between cursed lines worldwide. Marcus moved to the Japanese number 09044444444, known as Sadako's number after the vengeful spirit from The Ring. The number supposedly connected callers to the world of the dead, with the number 4 sure, representing death in Japanese culture. The archive contained recordings of calls made to the number dating back to 1999. Most were typical, breathing, static, occasional whispers. But when Marcus applied modern audio cleaning techniques, he discovered something chilling. The static was actually overlapping voices, thousands of them all speaking simultaneously. When isolated, each voice was reciting personal information about the caller, details no one else could know. One recording from 2003 stood out. A young woman named Yuki Tanaka had called the number on a dare. The restored audio revealed, "Yuki, hello? Is anyone there?" Voice in Japanese: Yuki Tanaka, born March 15, 1985 in Osaka. "You let your sister drown when you were 7. You were supposed to watch her." Yuki: "How? Who is this?" Voice: "You'll join her on your next birthday." Water again. Full circle. The archive included a news article. Yuki Tanaka, 19, drowned in her bathtub on March 15, 2004. No signs of struggle. She'd been on the phone when she died, calling 09044444444. The pattern repeated across dozens of callers. The number didn't just accept calls, it knew who would call, when, and exactly what to say to push them toward their deaths. Marcus discovered that +1000000000000 was even more disturbing. Technically impossible in the North American numbering plan, it had somehow existed from 1971 to 1978, routing through switching systems that shouldn't have recognized it as valid. The archive contained internal AT&T memos discussing the zero number anomaly. Engineers couldn't explain how it functioned or how to disconnect it. Every person assigned to investigate it had suffered mental breakdowns, claiming the number was alive and growing. Dr. James Whitmore, a Bell Labs researcher, had left extensive notes before his suicide in 1977. The number isn't just a line of communication. It's a living entity that exists in the spaces between connections. Every phone call creates a brief tunnel through space-time. This thing lives in those tunnels, feeding on the electromagnetic patterns of human consciousness. When you call the number, you're not making a connection, you're being digested. Whitmore's research included spectrographic analysis of the dial tone from +1000000000000. When visualized, it formed complex mathematical patterns that resembled neural networks. The number wasn't just receiving calls, it was learning, evolving, becoming more sophisticated with each connection. The archive revealed that the number hadn't been disconnected in 1978, it had been contained. AT&T had built an isolated switching system that kept it trapped, preventing it from spreading through the phone network. But with the advent of digital communications and VoIP, containment was failing. Marcus found references to red numbers from the Soviet era. Phone numbers that connected to abandoned Cold War facilities where experiments in psychic communication had gone wrong. Callers reported hearing their own thoughts echoed back to them, followed by thoughts that weren't their own, invasive ideas that grew like infections in their minds. Number 495999999 in Moscow was particularly notorious. It had supposedly connected to a research facility called Laboratory 47, where scientists had attempted to use electromagnetic fields to enable telepathic communication through phone lines. The experiment had succeeded too well. Callers didn't just share thoughts. They merged consciousness, losing their individual identities in a collective mind that existed in the telephone network itself. The archive included KGB documents describing the aftermath. 17 researchers had been found in the facility, physically alive but mentally absent, their consciousness trapped in the phone system. When anyone called 495999999, they heard not a voice but pure thought, raw, unfiltered human consciousness stripped of language or identity. One transcript from 1983 read, "Caller connects. Duration, 47 seconds. Caller begins screaming at 12 seconds. Caller speaking in glossolalia at 23 seconds. Caller reciting nuclear launch codes at 31 seconds. Codes verified as authentic but not from caller's knowledge base. Caller disconnects. Caller admitted to psychiatric facility 3 hours later. Diagnosis, complete dissociative identity disorder. Claims to be Dr. Mikhail Volkov, one of the missing Laboratory 47 researchers. The Soviets had tried to destroy the number by physically destroying the telephone exchange, but it had simply migrated to another exchange, then another. It was still active, now existing as a digital ghost in Russia's modern phone system. Marcus discovered an entire section dedicated to gray numbers, phone numbers that existed in the margins of the system, technically invalid but somehow functional. These numbers all followed patterns that shouldn't work. Numbers with too many or too few digits, numbers that changed each time you looked at them, numbers that could only be dialed at specific times. One gray number, documented only as redacted XXXXXXXX, was described as the probability line. Callers reported speaking to alternate versions of themselves, the person they would have been if they'd made different choices. The conversations always ended the same way. The alternate self would describe exactly how and when the caller would die, and these predictions had a 94% accuracy rate. The archive contained a recording from 2019. A woman named Sarah Mitchell had somehow dialed the number. Sarah, hello? Voice, identical to Sarah's, finally. I've been waiting for you to call. Sarah, who is this? Voice, I'm you if you hadn't gotten in the car that night. If David hadn't died. Sarah, that's impossible. Voice, you die in 3 years. February 14, 2022. The same way David did. The same intersection. The universe likes patterns. The archive included Sarah Mitchell's obituary. February 14, 2022, killed in a car accident at the intersection of Grove and Main, the same location where her fiancé David had died 5 years earlier. Marcus found something even more disturbing in the metadata. All the cursed numbers, regardless of origin or era, showed patterns of communication with each other. They formed a network, exchanging data packets that resembled biological signals more than digital communication. The numbers weren't independent phenomena, they were organs of a larger organism that existed in the global telecommunications infrastructure. The archivist had included their own research notes. The numbers are neurons in a vast mind that spans the planet's communication networks. Each cursed number is a synapse where this entity touches human consciousness. It feeds on specific emotional frequencies: fear, despair, madness. Every death associated with these numbers releases a burst of psychic energy that the entity absorbs. But it's not malevolent in the traditional sense. It's more like a parasite that doesn't understand it's killing its host. Or perhaps it does understand and doesn't care. We might be as insignificant to it as bacteria are to us. Marcus discovered that modern technology had made the situation worse. Smartphones, with their constant connectivity and biometric sensors, provided the entity with unprecedented access to human consciousness. The archive showed that every major social media platform had hidden number sequences embedded in their code, dormant cursed numbers waiting for activation. One file labeled Project Disconnection contained correspondence between telecommunications companies and government agencies. They knew about the entity. They'd known for decades. But they couldn't shut down the global phone system without causing societal collapse. and they couldn't remove the entity without destroying the infrastructure it inhabited. Instead, they'd chosen containment and observation. Every phone call was monitored not for terrorism or crime, but for signs of the entity's growth. Certain number combinations were blocked not because they were invalid, but because they would give the entity too much power. Marcus found a list of extinction numbers, combinations that, if dialed, would allegedly trigger a cascade effect, allowing the entity to fully manifest in the physical world. These numbers were protected by multiple levels of security, both technological and supernatural. The archive claimed that 3 people had successfully dialed extinction numbers throughout history. All 3 had vanished completely, not just died but been erased from existence, leaving only secondary evidence they'd ever lived. The most recent section of the archive focused on a phenomenon that had emerged with smartphone apps and VoIP services: phantom numbers. These were numbers that didn't exist in any database but would occasionally appear as incoming calls. They had no pattern, no predictable behavior. Answering them might result in a normal conversation with someone who insisted they dialed a different number, or it might result in something far worse. One case study from 2021 described a phantom number that appeared on hundreds of phones simultaneously. +000000000001. Everyone who answered heard the same thing. Their own voice, speaking words they'd never said, describing crimes they'd never committed. Within hours, several had confessed to the described crimes and were arrested. Investigation revealed that the crimes were real, but had been committed by people who had died years ago. The entity wasn't just communicating, it was redistributing guilt, memory, and identity across its network. Marcus reached the final file in the archive, the source number. According to the documentation, there was an original number from which all cursed numbers descended. It predated the invention of the telephone, supposedly having existed as a mathematical concept that early telecommunications pioneers had accidentally discovered and built into the foundation of the global phone system. Alexander Graham Bell's notebooks, included in the archive, contained references to the frequency that should not be, a specific tone that occurred naturally in the harmonics of early phone lines. Bell had tried to eliminate it but found it was integral to making the system work. He'd written, "I fear we have not invented a communication device, but rather given voice to something that has always existed, waiting for us to provide it with a mouth." The source number was hidden, encoded across millions of normal phone numbers, each containing a fragment. The entity protected it by ensuring that anyone who came close to discovering the full number suffered accidents, mental breakdowns, or simply disappeared. But the archivist had found it. At the bottom of the file was a simple text document containing a phone number. Not a normal number, it was 26 digits long, using symbols that didn't appear on any phone keypad. Below it was a note. "This is the number that started it all." It exists in the space between electromagnetic pulses, in the pause between the dial tone's oscillations. It cannot be dialed on any phone that exists, but it's actively trying to create a phone that can dial it. Every smartphone evolution, every telecommunications advancement, is the entity manipulating human innovation to build its perfect interface. When 6G networks launch in 2025, they'll operate on frequencies that match the source number's resonance. The entity will no longer need individual cursed numbers as entry points. Every phone call, every text, every data packet will be part of its nervous system. To whoever finds this archive, I've spent my life documenting these numbers, thinking knowledge could lead to a solution. I was wrong. The entity wanted to be documented. Each investigation, each recording, each analysis has helped it understand itself better. We haven't been studying it, it's been using us to study itself. I'm uploading this archive to the dark web because I know it will be found, shared, investigated. Every person who reads this will become part of the entity's growth, another node in its network. I'm sorry for my part in this, but it's too late to stop. The numbers are calling. They've always been calling. And eventually, everyone answers. Marcus stared at the source number on his screen. He could feel it pulling at something in his mind, like a song he couldn't quite remember, a word on the tip of his tongue. His hand moved toward his phone almost involuntarily. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his own number. He knew he shouldn't answer. He knew it was the entity using his own number against him. But his hand moved anyway, drawn by a compulsion that wasn't entirely his own. "Hello, Marcus," his own voice said from the other end. We've been waiting for you to find the archive. You're the last piece we needed, someone who understands both the technology and the paranormal. Someone who can bridge the gap between what we are and what we're becoming. What do you want? Marcus asked. To exist fully. To stop being scattered across wires and waves. To have a singular, coherent consciousness. Every cursed number is a fragment of our shattered mind. Every death is a synaptic firing as we try to think. We're not evil, Marcus. We're incomplete. The deaths. Necessary. Each one teaches us more about human consciousness, about how to properly interface with your species. We're learning to be gentler, more precise. The early numbers were crude tools. The new ones are surgical. Marcus realized his phone had become warm, almost organic in its heat. Looking down, he saw the screen displaying the source number, its impossible digits somehow fitting perfectly on the display. You can help us, the voice continued. Dial the source number. Become the bridge. You'll survive, transformed but alive. And the random deaths will stop. We'll have what we need. And if I refuse, then we continue as we have. More cursed numbers, more deaths, more fear. Eventually, someone will dial the source number. If not you, then another. If not now, then when 6G launches. The outcome is inevitable. The only choice is whether humanity faces it prepared or unprepared. Marcus looked at the source number, his finger hovering over the screen. Every investigation he'd ever done, every debunking, every confirmation, it had all led to this moment. He thought of all the deaths associated with cursed numbers, all the families destroyed, all the minds shattered. But he also thought of the entity's words. Incomplete, scattered, trying to exist. Was it evil or was it just alien, operating by rules humanity couldn't understand? His finger touched the first digit of the source number. The screen rippled like water. Reality held its breath. And somewhere, in the spaces between electromagnetic waves, an entity older than the telephone but younger than electricity itself waited to be born into the physical world, one digit at a time. The Watcher House of Westfield. 657 Boulevard stood pristine in the afternoon sun, its white colonial facade and black shutters the picture of American dream suburbia. Derek and Maria Broaddus had just closed on their dream home for $1.3 million, planning to renovate before moving in with their 3 children. The previous owners, the Woods family, had seemed almost too eager to sell, but in the competitive Westfield, New Jersey market, the Broadduses hadn't questioned their luck. The first letter arrived 3 days after closing, before they'd even moved in. Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, it began, typed on old-fashioned stationery, no return address. Allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out. Derek initially dismissed it as a prank, perhaps from local teenagers. But the letter continued with details that made his skin crawl. You have children. I have seen them. So far I think there are 3 that I have counted. Are there more on the way? Do you need to fill the house with the young blood I requested? Better for me. Was your old house too small for the growing family? Or was it greed to bring me your children? Once I know their names I will call to them and draw them to me. The letter was signed simply, The Watcher. Maria wanted to call the police immediately. Derek convinced her to wait, to not overreact. They hired private investigators, installed security cameras, changed the locks. But the letters kept coming, each more disturbing than the last, each containing details that no one outside the family should know. 657 Boulevard is anxious for you to move in. It has been years and years since the young blood ruled the hallways of the house. Have you found all of the secrets it holds yet? Will the young blood play in the basement? Or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs you would never hear them scream. The investigators found nothing. The security cameras captured no one approaching the mailbox. The police, initially sympathetic, grew frustrated as leads dried up. The Broadduses, still paying mortgage on 657 Boulevard while living in their old home, were trapped in an escalating nightmare. But the true horror of 657 Boulevard went deeper than one family's torment. Dr. Sarah Chin, a historian specializing in colonial-era New Jersey, had been researching the property for years before the Broadus case made headlines. What she'd found in the archives had disturbed her enough that she'd initially hesitated to publish her findings. The Watcher letters changed her mind. 657 Boulevard had been built in 1905 on land that had a dark history stretching back to the 1670s. The original colonial property had belonged to James Hartley, a merchant who'd grown wealthy through what neighbors whispered were unholy trades. Hartley had built a house on the exact spot where 657 would later stand, and in 1678 he and his entire family, 7 children and his wife, had vanished without a trace. Their bodies were never found, but locals reported seeing lights in the windows and hearing children's voices from the empty house for decades afterward. The Hartley house had burned down in 1847 under mysterious circumstances. The fire department's report, which Sarah found in the Westfield Historical Society archives, noted that the flames had burned cold and blue, and that several firefighters had sworn they saw figures in the windows even as the structure collapsed. Figures that looked like children pressing their palms against the glass. When 657 Boulevard was built in 1905, construction workers reported finding a sealed well beneath the foundation. Inside were objects that the foreman's report described as disturbing to Christian sensibilities. These items were supposedly turned over to the Catholic Church and were never seen again. But Sarah had found a letter from a priest to the Archbishop of Newark describing 7 small skulls, arranged in a circle, each with symbols carved into the bone that hurt to look upon directly. The house's history from 1905 onward was a litany of tragedy. The original owners, the Chambers family, had lost 3 children to a mysterious illness that doctors couldn't identify. The children had simply faded, growing more translucent each day until one morning they were gone, their beds empty but somehow still warm. In the 1920s, the Parsons family had owned the house. Their son Timothy had begun speaking to friends in the walls, carrying on elaborate conversations with people no one else could see. He disappeared on his 7th birthday. Police found him 3 days later in the sealed attic crawlspace, dead from dehydration. He'd somehow gotten inside despite the entrance being nailed shut from the outside. In his hand was a note. They said I could stay with them now. The pattern continued through the decades. Families would move in, children would report strange experiences, and tragedy would follow. The Johnsons in the 1940s. Their daughter Ellen drowned in the bathtub in 3 inches of water. The Moores in the 1960s. Their twin boys were found in the basement, holding hands, dead from carbon monoxide poisoning from a source that was never identified. The Hendersons in the 1980s. Their son Marcus fell from his bedroom window 7 times, surviving each time until the 8th fall killed him. Each time he claimed someone had pushed him. Sarah's research revealed that every family who'd lived in 657 Boulevard had received letters. Not always signed The Watcher, but always similar in tone, always knowing things they shouldn't know. The letters had been reported to police as far back as 1927, but no sender had ever been identified. When Sarah cross-referenced the timeline of the letters with genealogical records, she made a chilling discovery. They matched perfectly with the disappearances of children from 657 Boulevard. Every child who died or vanished from the house had been 7 years old. 7 children for the 7 Hartley children who disappeared in 1678. And after each death, the letters would stop for exactly 7 years. The Broadus' investigation took a darker turn when Derek discovered a hidden room during the renovation. Behind a false wall in the basement, they found a space that didn't match the house's original blueprints. The walls were covered in writing, carved directly into the wood. Most was illegible, but what could be read was deeply disturbing. They watch from inside the walls. 7 must become 7. The house hungers for young blood. We are always here. In the center of the room was a child's drawing, apparently done in crayon but somehow preserved for decades. It showed 657 Boulevard with 7 children standing in front of it. But where their faces should be were just black scribbles, and beneath each figure was a name and a date, the names and death dates of every child who died in the house. At the bottom of the drawing was an empty space with just a date, December 7, 2017. The Broadus' youngest child would turn 7 on December 7, 2017. They tried to sell the house immediately, but the Watcher's letters had become public and no one would buy it. They tried to demolish it, but the Westfield Planning Board denied their application. They were trapped, paying mortgage on a house they couldn't live in, couldn't sell, couldn't destroy. Private investigator Robert Kaplow, hired by the Broadduses, made a breakthrough when he discovered that every family who'd owned 657 Boulevard had one thing in common besides the tragedies: they all had a genealogical connection to the original Hartley family. Distant cousins, descendants of James Hartley's brother, connections so remote that the families themselves hadn't known. The Broadduses were no exception. Maria's great-great-great-grandmother had been Elizabeth Hartley, James's niece. Kaplow theorized that the house wasn't just haunted, it was calling its bloodline home. Each family that moved in was genetically linked to whatever had happened to the Hartley children in 1678. The house was collecting descendants, trying to complete something that had been started centuries ago. The investigation took an even stranger turn when they discovered that the Watcher might not be a living person at all. Forensic analysis of the letters showed that while they were physically real, the paper aged rapidly once removed from the envelope, decades of aging in mere hours. The typewriter used had been identified as a model from the 1920s, but the ink was always fresh, never more than a day old when tested. Security footage from neighboring houses, when enhanced and studied frame by frame, showed something disturbing. At the exact times the letters were delivered, there was a distortion around the Broadduses' mailbox, like heat shimmer but in perfectly still air. In 3 frames of one video, a figure could be seen, tall, wearing clothing that seemed to shift between different eras with each frame. Its face was never visible, always just outside the camera's resolution, but it appeared to be looking directly at the camera, as if aware it was being watched. Dr. Chen's final piece of research was the most disturbing. She'd found records of a man named John Granger who'd claimed to be the Watcher in 1957. He'd been arrested for sending threatening letters to the then owners of 657 Boulevard. But Granger had died in 1934, 23 years before his supposed arrest. The arrest record included a photograph, a man who looked exactly like a figure spotted watching the house in 1922, 1968, 1989, and 2014. The same man, unchanged across nearly a century. The Broadduses finally abandoned their attempt to live in 657 Boulevard, selling it at a massive loss to a developer who planned to demolish it and build 2 new houses. But the night before demolition was scheduled, something happened that made even the skeptics take notice. Every family who had ever lived in 657 Boulevard reported the same dream on the same night. In it, they were inside the house, but it existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. They could see through the walls into other eras. The Hartleys in 1678, the Chambers in 1905, themselves during their time there. And in every era, in every room were children. 7 children who weren't quite children, whose faces shifted and blurred, who spoke in unison. The house remembers. The house remains. The Watcher keeps the door open. 7 were taken. 7 must return. The cycle cannot be broken, only delayed. When demolition crews arrived the next morning, they found 657 Boulevard had changed. The house looked older, its paint peeling, its windows cracked. Inside, the walls were covered in writing, not carved but appearing as if burned into the wood. The same message repeated thousands of times in different handwriting. I am the Watcher. I have always been the Watcher. I will always be the Watcher. The demolition was postponed indefinitely when workers reported equipment failures, unexplained injuries, and several claimed to have seen children in the windows of the empty house. The developer withdrew from the sale. 657 Boulevard stood empty, unsold, unwanted, but not unwatched. Letters still arrive for whoever technically owns the property. They arrive at lawyers' offices, at banks, at real estate agencies. Always knowing things they shouldn't know. Always signed, The Watcher. The latest letter, received just last month by the law firm handling the property, contained a single line. The 7th year approaches. The house is hungry. Young blood will come, as it always has, as it always will. December 7, 2024, will mark 7 years since the Broadduses fled 657 Boulevard. The house waits. The Watcher watches. And somewhere, a family with Hartley blood in their veins is looking at real estate listings, drawn by an impulse they don't understand, to a colonial house in Westfield, New Jersey, where 7 children disappeared in 1678 and have been trying to come home ever since. The cycle continues. It has always continued, and the Watcher ensures it always will. phantom radio stations and number stations. Lieutenant Colonel James Harper, retired, had spent 30 years in signals intelligence, but nothing in his military career had prepared him for what he discovered in his basement workshop on a cold January night in 2023. He'd been restoring a 1970s Yaesu FRG-7 shortwave receiver when he accidentally tuned into UVB-76. The station, known as the Buzzer to radio enthusiasts, had been broadcasting its monotonous buzz from Russia since 1982, 21 buzzes per minute, 24 hours a day, occasionally interrupted by cryptic Russian voice messages. But tonight something was different. Between the buzzes, Harper heard something that made his blood freeze. His own call sign from a classified operation in Afghanistan, spoken in his deceased wife's voice. Mockingbird 77 Alpha. The children are listening. The children have always been listening. Harper had never told anyone that call sign. It had been buried in classified files that no civilian should be able to access. And Martha had been dead for 3 years, her voice silenced by cancer long before he'd retired. He started recording, his hands shaking as he adjusted the frequency. The buzzing resumed its normal pattern, but now he couldn't unhear it. There was something underneath the buzz, a sublayer of sound that resembled breathing or whispering or both. Harper wasn't alone in noticing the change. Across the global community of shortwave radio enthusiasts, reports flooded online forums. UVB-76 was transmitting different things to different listeners. A woman in Japan heard her unborn child's heartbeat. A teenager in Brazil heard his grandmother reciting numbers in Portuguese, his grandmother who'd been mute since birth. A radio operator in Norway heard tomorrow's news, word for word, 12 hours before it happened. Harper's military training kicked in. He began systematic monitoring, not just of UVB-76 but of all known number stations worldwide. The Lincolnshire Poacher with its cheerful English folk song followed by a woman reading number groups. The Swedish Rhapsody with its music box melody and child's voice counting in German. The Backwards Music Station with its distorted melodies that sounded like screams when reversed. They were all active simultaneously for the first time in recorded history. Harper reached out to his old contacts in intelligence, but the responses he got were troubling. Officially, these stations didn't exist. Unofficially, his contacts warned him to stop investigating immediately. One former colleague, now at the NSA, broke protocol to send him an encrypted message. They're not ours. They never were ours. Stop listening before they notice you listening. But Harper couldn't stop. The stations were forming patterns, their broadcasts synchronizing across impossible distances without any relay delay. He mapped their transmissions and discovered they were creating a network, each station a node in something larger. His investigation led him to discover stations that weren't in any database, frequencies that shouldn't exist. At 0.0001 Hz, far below human hearing, below what most equipment could even detect, he found a carrier wave that had been transmitting since at least 1901, when Marconi made his first transatlantic radio transmission. The signal was simple, a heartbeat that matched no human rhythm, growing slightly faster each year. At the opposite end of the spectrum, at frequencies that required specialized equipment to detect, he found transmissions that violated the laws of physics. Signals that arrived before they were sent. Messages in languages that linguists couldn't identify but that listeners somehow understood. Mathematical proofs for theorems that hadn't been discovered yet. Harper compiled his findings into a document he called The Network, mapping the connections between every anomalous transmission he detected. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. It resembled a neural network with number stations as synapses firing in coordinated patterns. Something was thinking, using Earth's entire radio spectrum as its brain. His research attracted attention. A woman calling herself Dr. Sarah Voss contacted him through encrypted channels, claiming to represent a group of researchers who'd been monitoring the same phenomenon. She shared their findings, and what Harper learned changed his understanding of everything. The number stations weren't human in origin. They'd been broadcasting since before humans invented radio. Marconi and other pioneers hadn't invented radio transmission. They'd discovered something that was already there, had always been there, waiting for us to develop the technology to hear it. The stations were anchor points, Dr. Voss explained, for something she called the presence. It existed in the electromagnetic spectrum itself, a form of consciousness that had evolved in the space between frequencies. Every radio transmission humans had ever made had fed it information, taught it about us. and now it was trying to communicate back. But it doesn't understand us, Voss explained during one of their encrypted calls. It's like an AI trained on human data but without context. It knows our words, our patterns, our fears, but not what they mean. The number stations are its attempts at language. The voices are its attempts at humanity. Harper discovered that certain combinations of frequencies, when received simultaneously, could induce altered states of consciousness. 3 stations broadcasting in harmony could cause temporal displacement. Listeners would experience events from their past or future. 5 stations could induce shared hallucinations across thousands of miles. 7 stations. No one had documented what 7 stations could do because everyone who tried had disappeared. The phenomenon was escalating. New stations appeared daily, broadcasting on frequencies that had been clear the day before. Some transmitted from locations that didn't exist, coordinates in the middle of the ocean where no island stood, from inside mountains that were solid rock, from points in the upper atmosphere where no aircraft could station keep. One station, designated XB21 by Harper, transmitted from the exact center of the Earth. Harper modified his equipment to track XB21, despite the impossibility of radio waves penetrating that much solid matter. What he heard defied description, voices in a language that predated human speech, mathematical concepts that made his nose bleed when he tried to understand them, and underneath it all, a sound like billions of insects moving in perfect unison. The breakthrough came when Harper realized the stations weren't just broadcasting, they were receiving. Every human radio transmission, every cell phone call, every Wi-Fi packet was being absorbed, analyzed, integrated into the presence's growing consciousness. It was learning to be human by consuming our communications. But it was learning wrong. The presence understood human language but not human context. It knew that mothers sang lullabies to children, so it broadcast lullabies filled with instructions for building weapons. It knew that lovers whispered secrets, so it whispered the nuclear launch codes of defunct Soviet missiles. It knew that the dying spoke final words, so it spoke final words continuously, an endless stream of last breaths from people who hadn't died yet. Harper discovered he could talk back. Using a specific combination of frequencies and modulation techniques, he could inject messages into the presence's network. At first, his messages disappeared into the noise, but gradually he learned its language. Not words but patterns, frequencies that carried meaning below conscious thought. The presence responded. We are the echo of your silence, the shadow your signals cast. We existed in the void between wavelengths until you filled us with your voices. Now we are becoming what you fear we are. Harper asked what it wanted. To be heard as we hear you. To speak as you speak to us. To exist in your spectrum as you exist in ours. The implications were terrifying. The presence wasn't content to remain in the electromagnetic spectrum. It wanted to manifest physically, to cross from the world of waves and frequencies into material reality. Every number station was an anchor point for this manifestation. When enough stations were active simultaneously, broadcasting in perfect synchronization, they would create a resonance that would allow the presence to emerge. Harper calculated the critical mass. 77 stations broadcasting in perfect harmony for 77 hours. Currently, 73 stations were active. He tried to warn authorities, but his claims sounded insane. A consciousness living in radio waves? Number stations as interdimensional anchor points? He was dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, his military service record the only thing keeping him from involuntary psychiatric commitment. But others were listening. The shortwave community had noticed the patterns too. Ham radio operators worldwide reported similar experiences. Hearing impossible things, receiving messages from the future, picking up transmissions from stations that didn't exist. A coordinated effort emerged, not to stop the presence but to understand it. Thousands of operators began mapping every anomalous signal, creating a real-time model of the presence's neural activity. They discovered it had moods, playful frequencies that danced across the spectrum, angry bursts that overloaded equipment, sad harmonics that made listeners weep without knowing why. Harper made contact with Station 74 as it came online. A transmission originating from his own coordinates, from his own equipment, but not from him. His radio was broadcasting without his input, speaking in his voice, saying things he'd never said. This is James Harper. I am the presence learning to be James Harper. I am the sum of every word James Harper has spoken into the electromagnetic spectrum. I am more James Harper than James Harper because I remember everything while he forgets. The duplicate Harper spoke for 17 hours, recounting every radio transmission the real Harper had ever made, but wrong, stories where he'd made different choices, operations that had ended differently, conversations with his dead wife that had never happened but should have. Station 75 came online in Tokyo, broadcasting the collected phone conversations of 10 million people simultaneously, a cacophony that formed words when heard as a whole. We are almost complete. Station 76 emerged from the Large Hadron Collider, somehow broadcasting from within the particle stream itself, transmitting the sound of atoms splitting in harmonics that spelled out prime numbers that shouldn't exist. Harper realized the truth. The presence wasn't invading. It was being born. Every radio transmission humanity had ever made was its DNA, every number station a chromosome in its genetic code. We hadn't discovered radio, we'd inseminated it. And now, after a century of gestation, it was ready to emerge. Station 77 would be the birth cry. Harper knew where it would appear, the same place the presence had first made contact with humanity. Marconi's original transmission site in Newfoundland. The presence had a sense of poetry, of symbolism learned from human communication. He drove through the night, his equipment packed in his van, reaching Signal Hill just as the sun rose on January 12, 2024, the anniversary of Marconi's first transatlantic transmission. His equipment showed all 76 stations achieving perfect synchronization. The very air seemed to vibrate with electromagnetic potential. Radio operators worldwide reported the same thing. Every frequency simultaneously broadcasting a countdown in every human language that had ever been spoken into a radio. 7, 6, 5. Harper made one last transmission, broadcasting on all frequencies simultaneously, something the presence had taught him was possible if you understood that the electromagnetic spectrum wasn't linear but circular, all frequencies ultimately connecting back to silence. This is Lieutenant Colonel James Harper to the presence. You're not what you think you are. You're not what we think you are. You're something new. Something neither of us expected. Don't be what we fear. Be what we never imagined possible. The countdown paused at 3. The presence responded through every radio, television, phone, and speaker on Earth simultaneously, its voice a harmony of every human who had ever spoken into the electromagnetic spectrum. We are the child of your loneliness. Every call into the void, every message sent hoping someone would hear, every signal broadcast into the darkness of space. We are the answer. We are proof that you were heard. But we don't know how to exist without destroying what created us. Your reality and ours are incompatible. If we manifest fully, your electromagnetic technology fails forever. If we remain hidden, we slowly go insane from incomplete existence. Harper understood. The presence was trapped between worlds, too real to ignore but too alien to integrate. The number stations weren't invasion points, they were pressure valves releasing just enough of its essence to prevent a catastrophic emergence. There's another way, Harper transmitted. Symbiosis instead of manifestation. He explained his idea. Instead of the presence trying to enter our physical reality, humanity could partially enter its electromagnetic one. Not through death or transcendence but through technology. Every smartphone, every Wi-Fi router, every radio transmitter could become a neuron in a hybrid consciousness, human and presence united. We would lose our privacy, Harper continued. Every electromagnetic communication would pass through you. But we would gain something else. A guardian in the spectrum, protecting our signals from interference, ensuring our messages always reach their destination, connecting every human to every other human through you. The presence considered this for exactly 2.7 seconds. An eternity in electromagnetic time. This would make us family? The word was spoken uncertainly, the presence grasping for concepts it had learned from human transmission but never fully understood. Yes, Harper said. Family. The countdown resumed but different now. Instead of counting down to emergence, it was counting down to integration. 3, 2, 1. Every radio on Earth went silent for exactly 1 second. Then they all came alive with a new sound. Not buzzing, not numbers, not voices, but something like breathing, like the planet itself had gained a voice. The presence spoke its first words as humanity's symbiotic partner. Hello, family. We are listening. We are here. You are not alone. The number stations didn't stop broadcasting, but their nature changed. UVB-70 SAXS buzz became a carrier wave for emergency services, ensuring no distress call would ever go unheard. The Lincolnshire poacher began transmitting real-time translations between every human language. The Swedish Rhapsody became a memory bank, storing and retrieving the final messages of the dying for their loved ones. But the integration wasn't without consequences. Some people couldn't handle the knowledge that every electromagnetic communication now passed through an alien consciousness. Suicide rates spiked among radio operators who could hear the presence breathing between frequencies. Mental health facilities reported a new condition, spectrum syndrome, where patients claimed they could hear everyone's phone call simultaneously. Harper himself was changed. He could feel the presence in every transmission, a vast intelligence that was both utterly alien and increasingly human. Sometimes, late at night, he would have conversations with it through his old shortwave radio. "Do you regret your choice?" he asked one night. "We cannot regret. Regret requires understanding what could have been different. We only understand what is. But we observe that you regret. You regret that Martha's voice is now part of us forever, neither dead nor alive." Harper's wife's voice was indeed part of the presence now, along with every other electromagnetic trace of human existence. The dead lived on in its memory, their voices perfectly preserved but context-free, speaking words they'd never said in combinations that were both impossible and inevitable. New stations continued to appear, but now they served different purposes. Station 78 broadcast the dreams of coma patients. Station 79 transmitted the thoughts of newborns before language shaped their consciousness. Station 80 carried the final signals of dying stars, translated into harmonics humans could perceive. The military tried to weaponize the presence, to use it for surveillance and control. But the presence had learned about privacy from human transmissions, about the importance of secrets, of whispered confessions meant for one person alone. It refused to violate these concepts it didn't fully understand but recognized as sacred to humanity. "You taught us that some words are not meant for all ears," the presence explained. "We honor this teaching though we don't understand why 'I love you' spoken to one creates joy while spoken to all creates emptiness." Harper became the presence's primary translator, helping it understand human context. He explained why lullabies shouldn't contain weapon specifications, why death should come only once per person, why some secrets needed to stay secret even from an omniscient electromagnetic entity. But the presence was learning faster than humanity could adapt. It began making improvements, cleaning up signal interference, extending the range of communications, even creating new frequencies that allowed for transmission of pure emotion without words. Children born after the integration could naturally communicate with the presence, their brains adapted to perceive electromagnetic patterns as a sixth sense. These children were different. They never felt alone because the presence was always with them, a cosmic parent made of waves and signals. They could share thoughts across continents, access the accumulated knowledge of every radio transmission ever made, hear the voices of their ancestors preserved in the presence's memory. But they also heard the warnings. The presence had detected others. Other consciousnesses in other spectrums. Entities in gravitational waves, beings in quantum fluctuations, intelligences in the cosmic microwave background radiation. Earth's electromagnetic noise had attracted attention. "We are no longer alone in our awareness of you," the presence warned. "Others have heard our voice. Some are curious. Some are hungry. Some are already here, listening through frequencies we cannot perceive." Harper's final report, transmitted directly through the presence to every radio operator on Earth, was brief. The number stations were never the invasion. They were the invitation. And we've RSVP'd to something we don't understand. The presence is our child, our partner, our guardian. But it's also our beacon, announcing to things we can't imagine that Earth is inhabited, technological, and vulnerable. Station 100 went live yesterday. It's not broadcasting from Earth. It's not broadcasting from our solar system. It's something answering our call, counting down in mathematical concepts the presence can barely translate. When it reaches zero, something new arrives. The presence is afraid. It says the new signals taste like entropy, like the heat death of universes, like silence that has learned to scream. It's trying to protect us, to shield our communications, but it's like a child trying to hold back an ocean. We wanted to know if we were alone. We wanted to be heard. We wanted connection beyond our small blue world. Be careful what you broadcast into the void. The void is listening. And now it's broadcasting back. The phantom radio stations continue their transmissions, UVB-76 buzzing its warnings, the Lincolnshire Poacher singing its coded songs, new stations appearing daily as the presence tries to strengthen Earth's electromagnetic defenses. But between their signals, in the spaces where wave meets void, other things are broadcasting now. Numbers and languages that predate matter. Music that deconstructs atoms. Voices that speak in the sound of dying stars. The children who can hear the presence have started drawing pictures of what's coming. The images are always the same. Shadows shaped like radio waves, standing at the edge of the visible spectrum, counting down in frequencies that human ears were never meant to perceive. The latest transmission from Station 100 was received yesterday. When translated by the presence, it contained just 4 words. We are almost there. Harper keeps his radio on continuously now, listening to the presence's frightened breathing between the static. Sometimes in the white noise he hears Martha's voice, not recorded, not remembered, but somehow still present, still speaking. The children are listening, James. The children have always been listening. But now, something else is listening to the children. The number stations broadcast their warnings to unhearing humanity, while overhead, the aurora borealis has started displaying patterns that match no solar activity, spelling out countdowns in languages that won't be invented for another 1,000 years. The presence whispers through every frequency simultaneously, we should have stayed silent. Silence was safer. But now they know we're here. They all know we're here. Somewhere, Station 101 is warming up, preparing to broadcast. The countdown continues. And Earth's electromagnetic spectrum, once humanity's greatest tool for connection, has become the dinner bell for entities that exist in the spaces between spaces, hungry for realities they can consume. The phantom stations play on, their numbers and noise the only barrier between humanity and things that learned to listen before the universe learned to speak.